Chapter 2346. Now that Chu Fengmian had inherited the Sword Emperor Crown's memory, he knew a lot about Tianjiu Domain and the three great saint domains. Although celestial saints were absolute overlords in Tianjiu Domain, Chu Fengmian was the disciple of the Master of Sword Dao. Tianjiu Domain had once besieged the Master of Sword Dao, and even celestial emperors had been mobilized. It wasn't strange for a celestial saint to be mobilized for Chu Fengmian. The 7 major sects represented the giants that controlled the entire Tianjiu Domain. Their strength was unfathomable. Chu Fengmian didn't dare to be careless now. The best chance to improve his strength was to step into the celestial realm. Once he stepped into the celestial realm, Chu Fengmian's accumulation of various opportunities would be completely unleashed. At that time, Chu Fengmian would be considered a true expert. After passing through 7 or 8 star domains, the scene in front of him suddenly became illusory. Chu Fengmian felt that the vast starry sky in front of him was already in between reality and illusion. There were countless spatial turbulences and spatial storms that were running rampant in it. Vaguely, this starry sky was a huge pitch-black ring. In the depths of this ring, it seemed to be connected to other places. This is the star hole. Chu Fengmian couldn't help muttering to himself when he saw the scene in front of him. Chu Fengmian had only seen some descriptions of this star hole in the Sword Emperor Crown's memory. Now that he saw it with his own eyes, it was even more shocking than the description. The huge star hole was as big as several star domains. He couldn't see the end of it at a glance. It was pitch black inside the star hole, and no one dared to approach it. Chu Fengmian observed the star hole in front of him. After confirming that it was the same star hole as the Sword Emperor Crown's memory, Chu Fengmian moved and slowly stepped into the star hole. Chu Fengmian's escape light had just entered the star hole when he seemed to have arrived at another space. The star hole was a unique area created by the collision between 2 universes. Its laws were different from the laws of the extraterritorial starry sky. It was more solid. The moment Chu Fengmian stepped into the star hole, a spatial storm swept towards Chu Fengmian. Spatial storms weren't rare in the extraterritorial starry sky. It was also one of the biggest troubles that demon gods encountered when they traveled through the extraterritorial starry sky. However, typical warriors and demon gods at Emperor Gu's level had the ability to traverse the cosmos with their bodies. They could withstand the attacks of spatial storms. However, the spatial storm in the star hole was much more powerful than the one in the extraterritorial starry sky. Chu Fengmian's body swayed slightly when the spatial storm reached him. This spatial storm had the ability to affect Chu Fengmian. It should be noted that with Chu Fengmian's current strength, an ordinary celestial realm martial artist or demon god would not be able to shake Chu Fengmian in the slightest even if they attacked him with all their might. Only immortal warriors, or even immortal general realm martial artists and demon immortals can withstand this spatial storm. Chu Fengmian observed the power of the spatial storm and said aloud, "An immortal warrior who has just stepped into the celestial realm would have to rely on the power of an immortal artifact to resist it." This spatial storm was nothing to Chu Fengmian, but to a celestial realm martial artist, it was already considered a considerable trouble. Therefore, in the memory of the Sword Emperor Crown, there was a reminder that martial artists and demon gods who had not passed the celestial tribulation could not pass through the star hole. Moreover, even among the celestial realm, one had to be at least immortal warriors or even immortal generals to safely pass through the star hole and head to the 3 great sacred regions. Although Chu Fengmian's current realm was only half a step into the celestial realm, his true strength had already reached the level of Immortal Lord. The spatial storm in the star hole had no effect on Chu Fengmian at all. Chu Fengmian only took a glance and continued to fly deeper into the star hole. On the other side of the deepest part of the star hole was the universe where the 3 great sacred regions were located. It was no wonder that there had always been rumors about the three great sacred regions in the extraterritorial starry sky, but there were very few people who had actually come into contact with them. The three great sacred regions and the extraterritorial starry sky were not in the same universe. Apart from celestial realm experts, others could not enter the three great sacred regions at all. In this star hole, there were dangerous spatial storms, spatial turbulence, and even some spatial rifts and so on. Among them, the most dangerous were the spatial rift. The star hole was an area created by the collision between two universes. However, during this collision, some spatial rifts would also appear. These spatial rifts were located between the two universes. At every moment, it would be squeezed between the two universes. Once someone fell into the spatial rifts, there was almost no chance of survival. No one could survive the collision between the two universes. Chu Fengmian could not imagine how great the power of a universe was. Even with his current strength, Chu Fengmian could not explore how big the extraterritorial starry sky was. Chu Fengmian did not dare to try the collision force. When encountering spatial rifts, Chu Fengmian would also stay far away, not daring to touch them. Fortunately, spatial rifts generally stayed in one place. As long as one did not take the initiative to approach them, there would generally be no danger. The star hole was as big as a dozen star domains. After a full day, Chu Fengmian had only flown about half the distance of the star hole. In this star hole, in addition to the three great dangers of spatial storms, spatial turbulence, and spatial rifts, there were also some strange dangers. There were many dangers that even the Sword Emperor crown did not record in detail. After all, even an immortal emperor might not be able to understand all the mysteries of the star hole. Chu Fengmian did not dare to fly at full speed. He was also paying attention to the surrounding situation at all times to avoid encountering any danger. Among the martial artists and demon immortals who had tried to enter the three great sacred regions through the star hole, many had died in the star hole. Chu Fengmian moved forward carefully. During this day, Chu Fengmian did not encounter any danger. When encountering some spatial rifts, Chu Fengmian avoided them. During this day, Chu Fengmian did not encounter any other martial artists or demon immortals in the star hole. The star hole was incomparably dangerous. Apart from the martial artists and demon immortals who had decided to enter the three great sacred regions, no one else would set foot in it. Chu Fengmian moved forward all by himself. However, Chu Fengmian discovered many tracks. Some tracks were clearly the tracks of people who had passed through. Some of the tracks were at most a few years old. Clearly, there were people who had used the star hole to enter the three great sacred regions recently. This made Chu Fengmian feel a lot more at ease. What Chu Fengmian was most worried about was whether the star hole would undergo any changes in the tens of millions of years. After all, Chu Fengmian knew about the star hole from the Sword Emperor crown. It had been tens of millions of years since the destruction of the Sword sect. Chapter 2347. The star hole was the place where two universes collided. Generally, it would not change since its birth. However, there were exceptions to everything. There were some records in the Sword Emperor crown that some changes had occurred in some star holes, causing countless chaotic places to appear. Today, all the martial artists and demon gods in those places had fallen. Chu Fengmian was relieved to see that there were still people passing through the star hole in recent years. He continued to move forward. As Chu Fengmian entered the depths of the star hole, there were more and more spatial storms in the star hole. However, these spatial storms did not have much effect on Chu Fengmian. However, Chu Fengmian soon noticed that the surrounding laws had undergone some changes. The star cavern was a place where two universes collided. For example, when Chu Fengmian had first entered the star cavern, the magical laws within had been closer to those of the starry sky outside the realm. It had only been affected by the three saint realms that had caused some changes. Now, as Chu Fengmian had crossed more than half of the star hole, he had arrived at a place closer to the three great sacred realms. The surrounding laws were much stronger than the laws of the extraterritorial starry sky, especially the space Tao. Chu Fengmian estimated that only martial artists and demon gods who had reached the immortal king realm had the ability to break through space. The laws here were many times stronger than those in the extraterritorial starry sky. In the extraterritorial starry sky, an emperor could easily break through space. However, in the area where Chu Fengmian was now, one had to be at least an immortal king to do so. These were not the complete laws of the three great sacred realms. After all, this was still the star hole. Although it was very close to the three great sacred realms, it was still affected by some of the laws of the extraterritorial starry sky. The real laws of the three great sacred realms might be much stronger than here. According to the Sword Emperor Crown's memory, the spatial laws of the three great sacred realms needed at least an existence at the peak of the immortal monarch realm to be qualified to break through. It could be said that if Chu Fengmian went to the three great sacred realms now, it would be very difficult for him to break through space. The laws of the two were on a completely different level. However, Chu Fengmian was not surprised by this. The laws of heaven and earth represented the upper limit of a universe. It was like a shallow pond, it was impossible for a huge whale to be born. If the laws of the three great sacred realms were the same as the outer realm, there wouldn't be so many experts born. This was also the reason why the martial artists and demon gods in the outer realm were usually at the peak of the immortal king realm at most. It wasn't that they didn't want to break through, but because the laws of the outer realm were too weak, it was extremely difficult for them to improve. For example, in the 9 domains, because the 7 major sects were related to the 9 domains, there were still peak immortal kings who were willing to stay. In the outer realms, most immortal generals and immortal marquises would leave the outer realms and head to the three great sacred realms to break through to higher realms. However, Chu Fengmian was even more special. However, his cultivation level had been stuck at the half-step celestial realm. That was because if he wanted to pass the great tribulation of the celestial realm, he needed the power of heaven and earth. Even if all the power of heaven and earth in the 9 regions were added together, it would not be enough. In the entire outer space, there was no place for Chu Fengmian to transcend the Deva tribulation. As a result, Chu Fengmian's cultivation was stuck at the half-step Deva realm, unable to advance any further. This was also the biggest reason why Chu Fengmian wanted to go to the three great sacred realms. The closer he got to the three great sacred realms, the more Chu Fengmian felt that the power of heaven and earth around him had changed along with the laws. The power of heaven and earth here had reached the level of 3 or 4 times that of the 9 domains. Vaguely, the power of heaven and earth began to accumulate above Chu Fengmian's head. Chu Fengmian's strength had long reached the level of triggering the great tribulation of the celestial realm. Originally, when Chu Fengmian left the ruins of the Shang Sword sect, he was already unable to suppress the power of heaven and earth from descending. However, at that time, because the power of heaven and earth in the 9 domains did not accumulate for Chu Fengmian's great tribulation of the celestial realm, it did not descend for a long time. Now, Chu Fengmian's strength was more than 10 times or 100 times stronger than when he had just left the ruins of the Shang Sword sect. Chu Fengmian also felt that the moment he stepped into the three great sacred realms, the great tribulation of the celestial realm would descend. However, he did not expect that Chu Fengmian had not really stepped into the three great sacred realms yet. He was still in the star cave, and the power of heaven and earth had begun to accumulate. This was obviously the time to gather power and prepare to trigger the great tribulation of the celestial realm. It's a little troublesome. Chu Fengmian's expression changed slightly. Transcending the great tribulation of the celestial realm shouldn't pose any danger to Chu Fengmian with his current strength. Even if Chu Fengmian was a mutated species of the world and was not tolerated by the heavenly Tao, now that Chu Fengmian was in control of the Taichu sword and his strength had reached the immortal monarch realm, no matter how powerful the great tribulation of the celestial realm was, it should not be able to threaten Chu Fengmian. Even the heavenly Tao had its own rules, and the power of the great tribulation of the celestial realm could not grow endlessly. However, what Chu Fengmian did not expect was that the great tribulation of the celestial realm would descend in the Star Cave. The Star Cave was an extremely dangerous place, especially the spatial fissures in it. Once Chu Fengmian accidentally entered it, he would fall into an irrecoverable situation. Moreover, in addition to the spatial storms and spatial fissures, there were even more terrifying dangers in the Star Cave. Where two universes collided, all kinds of dangers could appear. Therefore, generally, those who passed through the Star Cave were very careful and did not dare to stay in the Star Cave for fear of encountering danger. However, according to the speed at which the power of heaven and earth was condensing, Chu Fengmian's great tribulation of the celestial realm would descend in the Star Cave. This was extremely dangerous for Chu Fengmian. Transcending the tribulation in the Star Cave was simply an act of courting death. If there was any accident, Chu Fengmian would die on the spot. Chu Fengmian had calculated everything, but he had never considered this point. Even if he had calculated this point, Chu Fengmian didn't have a second path to take. There was only one way to go to the three great sacred regions through the Star Cave. No matter which Star Cave Chu Fengmian went to, he would face this scene. Even if Chu Fengmian retreated now and came a second time, the result would be the same. Damn it, I didn't expect to be tricked. Chu Fengmian's eyes were extremely cold. He noticed that the gathering of the power of heaven and earth was not normal. It was not gathering normally, but was shrouded by an invisible force that condensed the power of heaven and earth of the entire Star Cave. Obviously, the great tribulation of the celestial realm would descend in the Star Cave, forcing Chu Fengmian to transcend the tribulation in the Star Cave. Chapter 2348. Originally, the celestial tribulation was not very dangerous to Chu Fengmian, but if it came in the Star Cave, it would be completely different. In particular, the Star Cave was a unique area produced by the collision of two universes. It was extremely unstable. Even in normal times, it would produce some special fluctuations, which would become a lot of dangers in the Star Cave. If the celestial tribulation came, no one knew what kind of impact it would have on the Star Cave. The power of heaven and earth gathered above Chu Fengmian's head like a time bomb that could explode at any time. It could even detonate the Star Cave. I must leave as soon as possible. Chu Fengmian made a prompt decision. He suddenly accelerated and flew toward the end of the Star Cave. Even if Chu Fengmian retreated now, the celestial tribulation would come the next time he entered the Star Cave. It was impossible for Chu Fengmian to avoid it. Therefore, it was meaningless to lie low for the time being. What's more, the 9 heavens regions were about to appear. Chu Fengmian didn't have much time left. He didn't want to waste any more time. It was better to rush out directly. As long as he could leave the Star Cave and enter the 3 sacred realms, the celestial tribulation would not pose much threat to him. Chu Fengmian's escape light was pushed to the extreme, and its speed was 2 or 3 times faster than before. Previously, Chu Fengmian was still observing the various structures and mysteries in the Star Cave. After all, this was the first time Chu Fengmian saw the Star Cave with his own eyes. But now, Chu Fengmian didn't have the energy to pay attention to it. Chu Fengmian pushed the escape light to the extreme and flew toward the depths of the Star Cave. At the same time, he had his doppelganger pay attention to the space cracks, so as not to accidentally enter them. At the same time, the power of heaven and earth was still accumulating above Chu Fengmian's head. The power of heaven and earth was several times more condensed than the strongest state of the 9 heavens regions. The stronger Chu Fengmian was, the more opportunities he would get, and the more terrifying the power of the celestial tribulation would be. It could be said that the celestial tribulation that Chu Fengmian was about to face might become the most powerful celestial tribulation in the world, which could be recorded in history. According to the previous speed, it would take at least 1 day to reach the other side of the star cave. But now, in just 6 hours, Chu Fengmian's escape light had already covered more than half the distance. As Chu Fengmian got closer and closer to the 3 sacred domains, the various nomological laws in the space around him also developed in the direction of the 3 sacred domains. At the same time, the power of heaven and earth contained in it also became stronger. The speed at which the power of heaven and earth gathered above Chu Fengmian's head became even faster. A vast expanse of tribulation clouds had gathered over Chu Fengmian's head, hundreds or even thousands of times larger than the tribulation clouds that appeared during the Deva tribulation. As the power of heaven and earth continued to gather, the tribulation clouds continued to expand. Wherever Chu Fengmian's escape light went, that place would be shrouded by layers of tribulation clouds. The tribulation clouds would follow Chu Fengmian wherever he went. The speed of condensation has increased. We need to speed up. Chu Fengmian didn't dare to be careless. Once the celestial tribulation descended in the star cave, Chu Fengmian was well aware of the countless dangers involved. Chu Fengmian suddenly let out a long roar, and the bloodline of progenitor Tianlong erupted from his bloodline. Billowing bloodline power condensed on Chu Fengmian's body. Chu Fengmian transformed into progenitor Tianlong's appearance and flew into the depths of the star cave like a stream of light. After transforming into progenitor Tianlong, Chu Fengmian's escape light became much faster. Chu Fengmian's transformation into progenitor Tianlong might not be his strongest state, but it was his fastest state. Progenitor Tianlong controlled the Tao of space. Once Chu Fengmian transformed into progenitor Tianlong, he could feel that the suppression of the surrounding nomological laws on Chu Fengmian had lessened a lot, allowing Chu Fengmian to move even faster. Another 2 hours later, Chu Fengmian had entered the deepest part of the star cave. He could even vaguely see the dazzling light in the depths of the star cave. The celestial 9 domains were already in front of him. Rumble! But at this moment, the sound of thunder resounded. From the tribulation cloud above Chu Fengmian's head, a thunderclap resounded, and a golden thunderbolt blasted towards Chu Fengmian. Damn it, I still can't dodge it. Chu Fengmian's face turned extremely ugly when he heard the thunderclap. He originally wanted to wait until the Great Tribulation of Deva to rush into the celestial 9 domains, but he didn't expect that the Great Tribulation of Deva would still come. Even Chu Fengmian felt that the power of the Great Tribulation of Deva hadn't accumulated to the peak yet, but it still fell in a hurry. It seemed to be deliberately leaving Chu Fengmian in the star cave so that the tribulation would come. Since you want to kill me so much, I'd like to see what you can do. Chu Fengmian's face showed some anger. The Great Tribulation of Deva was deliberately targeting Chu Fengmian. Since there was no way to avoid it, Chu Fengmian wouldn't be afraid of it. So what if he underwent the tribulation in the star cave? Chu Fengmian had done more than 1 or 2 heaven-defying things. So what if he did one more? Sword out! Chu Fengmian raised his head and looked at the descending golden thunderbolt. With a long roar, he immediately turned into his human form and drew out his 2 swords. Suddenly, a sword light pointed at the sky and slashed out. Bam! The descending golden thunderbolt was suddenly torn apart by the sword light. It exploded and was destroyed by the sword light. However, more golden thunderbolts came down from the tribulation cloud. The tribulation cloud above Chu Fengmian's head was almost 10,000 times larger than the tribulation clouds condensed by other people's Great Tribulation of Deva. This also meant that Chu Fengmian had to bear the Great Tribulation of Deva that was 10,000 times stronger than that of other martial artists and demon gods. Chu Fengmian, as a variant of heaven and earth, was not tolerated by the way of heaven. Any tribulation was the best time to kill Chu Fengmian. The Great Tribulation of Deva chose to forcibly descend in the Star Cave in order to use the power of the Star Cave to kill Chufengmian here. The rolling thunderbolts condensed together and fell from the sky like rolling seawater. There were tens of thousands of golden thunderbolts in the Sea of Thunderbolt. The power of each of these golden thunderbolts was not inferior to the full strength of a Deva realm martial artist. Although a celestial realm warrior was nothing in front of the current Chufengmian, once 10,000 celestial realm warriors attacked together, the power that erupted was incomparably terrifying. It was even enough to shake the immortal monarchs. Chapter 2349. Tens of thousands of golden thunderbolts converged into an ocean, pouring down from the sky. Come! Chufengmian's eyes were resolute and fearless. Streams of sword intent emerged from his back and infused into his two swords. Chufengmian combined his two swords and slashed towards the sky, turning into a huge sword ray that cut into the thunderbolts. The Sea of Thunderbolts was cut into two halves. Countless thunderbolts fell, but they couldn't get close to Chufengmian. A few thunderbolts that got close to Chufengmian were devoured by a force and turned into nothingness when they were 3 feet away from Chufengmian. Behind Chufengmian, the shadows of the 3 innate divine beasts, Xian Jing, Tianlong and the heaven-devouring beast, all condensed. The heaven-devouring beast opened its mouth and turned into a huge black hole above Chufengmian's head. All the thunderbolts that got close to Chufengmian were devoured by the black hole and turned into Chufengmian's power. The power of thunderbolts was the power of creation, the power of heaven and earth that judged all things. It was a terror that any martial artist or demon god could not avoid. Once the power of thunderbolts invaded one's body, the internal organs would be eroded by the power of thunderbolt. The power of thunderbolts was especially difficult to deal with. It was almost impossible to disperse and expel the power of thunderbolt. For example, Mad Dragon Emperor was once injured by a heaven-defying tribulation. Tens of thousands of years ago, he could only linger on at death's door. He couldn't do anything about the power of thunderbolt, but Chufengmian was the only exception. His natal sword origin was formed by devouring the power of creation. Even if the power of thunderbolts was devoured by the heaven-devouring secret technique, they would be immediately devoured by Chufengmian's natal sword origin. The source of thunderbolts was the power of creation, which was enough to refine Chufengmian's natal sword origin. Therefore, as long as Chufengmian could withstand it, he could devour thunderbolts without restraint. The power of thunderbolts was originally meant to destroy Chufengmian, but today Chufengmian wanted to devour it and turn it into his power. Heaven-devouring secret technique. Devouring heaven and earth. Devouring the thunderbolts that escaped the blade was not enough for Chufengmian. He suddenly roared and pushed the heaven-devouring origin to the extreme. Suddenly, the black hole above Chufengmian's head expanded to dozens of miles, even bigger than Chufengmian's sword intent. Countless lightning bolts were sucked into the black hole by this massive devouring force before they could even descend. Then, a steady stream of lightning power entered Chufengmian's body. The power of lightning did not have the time to destroy Chufengmian's body. It was suppressed by Chufengmian's natal sword origin, turning into the purest power of creation and fusing with it. Fengmian. Of the world of his sword a few times. Of the times. The sword. Was. Chufengmian's strength had been improved crazily through countless opportunities, but the only way to improve his sword was to devour the power of creation. There were very few opportunities to devour the power of creation. It could only devour the tribulation thunder. This time, the celestial tribulation brought down so many tribulation thunders that the sword was full. Chufengmian unscrupulously activated the heaven-devouring secret technique to devour the countless tribulation thunders. He did not take the celestial tribulation seriously at all. Rumble! Thunder roared in the tribulation clouds. The celestial tribulation was infuriated by Chu Fengmian. Suddenly, countless tribulation thunders came down. This time, the tribulation thunders were not golden, but black. The power contained in the black thunders was greater and more violent. It was the power to destroy everything. The thunder of destruction. The thunder of destruction. The thunder of destruction, which usually only came when heavenly punishment, came down with a loud bang. Hundreds of thunder of destruction came down. It seemed that all life would be extinguished under the thunder. Any of these hundreds of thunder of destruction would be a natural disaster if it fell on a continent. It could wipe out most of the creatures in any of the 9 regions. If it was some weak continent, one thunder of destruction could destroy the entire continent. But now, hundreds of thunder of destruction came down all at once, aiming at Chu Fengmian. The moment Chu Fengmian saw the thunder of destruction, his mind moved and he immediately withdrew the heaven-devouring secret technique. The thunder of destruction was different from the tribulation thunders just now. Even if Chu Fengmian had the sword, he could not dissolve the power of the thunder of destruction. After all, Chu Fengmian only controlled a part of the power of creation. He could devour the tribulation thunders, but not the thunder of destruction. That did not mean that Chu Fengmian could not deal with the thunder of destruction. Yin Yang. Purple crystal. Within Chu Fengmian's 2 swords, 2 streaks of sword will converged on the edges of the swords. With a loud bang, they struck out, directly descending to devour. The thunder of destruction. Rumble. The power of the 2 swords collided with the power of the thunder of destruction in the air. But it was crushed by the thunder of destruction for only a moment. The thunder of destruction deserved the name of destruction. It was completely different from the ordinary tribulation thunders. But Chu Fengmian already knew the result. The moment he struck out with his 2 swords, Chu Fengmian performed his swordsmanship again. The power of the stars was added to the blades, and a sword Qi Star River soared into the sky. The sword Qi Star River collided with the thunder of destruction again. This time, the stalemate lasted for almost a minute. The sword Qi Star River began to shatter under the power of destruction. It could not resist the arrival of the thunder of destruction. What a terrifying thunder of destruction! Chu Fengmian's eyes were full of fear. He had seen the thunder of destruction before, but it was completely different from the one Chu Fengmian saw now. The strength of the tribulation thunders depended on the power of heaven and earth gathered. With the power of heaven and earth of the 9 regions, even the most powerful tribulation thunders could only condense a part of the power of the real tribulation thunders. But now, Chu Fengmian was extremely close to the 3 great sacred regions. The laws and the power of heaven and earth here were no different from the 3 great sacred regions. It could be said that the condensed thunder of destruction was the real power of the thunder of destruction. Chapter 2350. I can't resist it with my current strength? Chu Fengmian exclaimed as he watched the thunder of destruction descend and break the sword Qi Galaxy. He had exerted at least 90% of his strength in his normal form, but he still couldn't resist the thunder of destruction. Chu Fengmian's 90% strength in his normal form was much stronger than most of the peak Immortal King Realm warriors and demon immortals. It was enough for him to fight 2 experts like Desolate Celestial Dipper and Star Emperor. But now, he still couldn't resist the thunder of destruction. Damn God, you think highly of me! Chu Fengmian's lips curled into a cold smile. Unless it was someone like the Devil Emperor, no one at the peak of the Immortal King realm would be able to withstand the great tribulation of heaven and man. The great celestial tribulation was just a tribulation from a half-step celestial being to the celestial being realm, but it had condensed such power. It seemed that this great celestial tribulation really intended to kill Chu Fengmian. If Chu Fengmian hadn't wiped out the 7 sects and improved his strength, He wouldn't have been able to resist the great celestial tribulation when he just left Shang's sword sect. But now, Chu Fengmian still had a trump card. Immortal! Chu Fengmian roared. Suddenly, the power of the 4 immortal inscriptions in Chu Fengmian's immortal real body was pushed to the extreme. In an instant, a huge force enveloped Chu Fengmian's body. Under the cover of this force, Chu Fengmian's body expanded crazily and became dozens of times bigger, turning into a bronze giant that was dozens of meters tall. Bronze Heavenly Demon. After Chu Fengmian pushed the power of the immortal inscriptions to the extreme, he would transform into the Bronze Heavenly Demon. This was his strongest form now, much stronger than when he was in his human form. This was also because Chu Fengmian's immortal real body didn't have the restriction of the realm, so now the power of the immortal real body was greater than the power of Chu Fengmian's original realm. Releasing all the power of the immortal real body was Chu Fengmian's strongest form now. After transforming into the Bronze Heavenly Devil, Chu Fengmian's strength increased by several times. The ancestral Dragon Supreme Sword and the Titanic Godly Sword suddenly enlarged in Chu Fengmian's hand, turning into giant swords that were dozens of meters long, perfectly fitting Chu Fengmian's current form. Break! Chu Fengmian clenched his swords and slashed at the air. Chu Fengmian didn't use any swordsmanship in this strike. He just used pure strength to strike. With Chu Fengmian's sword Dao realm, even a casual strike from him would have the power of an ordinary immortal technique. Chu Fengmian didn't need to comprehend any sword arts below the immortal technique level. After all, Chu Fengmian only relied on his sword Dao and instinctively swung his sword, which was far more powerful than those sword arts. The sword light shot out like a beam of golden light and pierced into the destructive thunder that was rolling down. In an instant, countless explosions erupted from the thunder of destruction. When the sword light struck the thunder of destruction, it was unknown how many thunder of destruction were destroyed in an instant. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of destructive thunderbolts roared down. The sea of thunderbolts was completely destroyed by the sword light. The Bronze Heavenly Demon form was much more powerful than Chu Fengmian's human form. In his human form, Chu Fengmian's strength was at most comparable to 2 or 3 peak immortal kings. However, once he transformed into the Bronze Heavenly Demon, he was strong enough to contend with experts like the Demon Emperor. The Demon Emperor's strength was no longer in the immortal king realm. He could be called a true immortal monarch. He was even stronger than many warriors who had just stepped into the immortal monarch realm. However, he was still no match for Chu Fengmian in his Bronze Heavenly Demon form. These hundreds of destructive thunderbolts were easily dealt with after Chu Fengmian transformed into the Bronze Heavenly Demon. However, the tribulation clouds hadn't dispersed yet. Chu Fengmian could clearly feel that there was an even more terrifying power in the tribulation clouds. It was accumulating and preparing to descend. Thunder roared. All the tribulation clouds rapidly shrank and almost condensed together. Only one tribulation cloud was left. Looking at this tribulation cloud, Chu Fengmian's eyes were full of fear. This tribulation cloud was the condensation of the tens of thousands of tribulation clouds just now. The power in it was condensed to an incredible extent. What on earth is this? Chu Fengmian looked at the tribulation clouds. He suddenly felt a little nervous. A sense of danger appeared in his mind. Chu Fengmian hadn't felt such a sense of danger for a long time. The last time was when he was facing the ancient desolation White Wolf in the Sword Sect ruins. That was when Chu Fengmian felt this way. Chu Fengmian only felt this way when he faced some opponents that he couldn't resist. The more the tribulation cloud's power condensed, the more uneasy Chu Fengmian felt. He raised his head with a cold look in his eyes. Instead of waiting for death, it was better to take the initiative to attack. The celestial tribulation was a threshold that Chu Fengmian had to cross. He had to cross this threshold. If Chu Fengmian couldn't even cross this small celestial tribulation, how could he face the experts of Tianzhu regions? Whoosh! Chu Fengmian's figure soared into the sky. Behind him, the two innate divine beasts, Xianjing and Tianlong, roared. Suddenly, their power condensed on Chu Fengmian's two swords. Longjing, shatter the sea. Boom! Chu Fengmian's two swords slashed out at the tribulation clouds. Dazzling sword light slashed out and collided with the tribulation clouds. The tribulation clouds were shattered into pieces by the collision. Destroy. But at this moment, a voice suddenly descended from the sky. The voice seemed to be transmitted from the tribulation thunder. Chu Fengmian's body trembled. His eyes were filled with disbelief. Someone in the tribulation clouds actually spoke. Chu Fengmian recognized that the voice was transmitted from the tribulation clouds. Tribulation clouds and heavenly tribulations were recorded in countless ancient books. They were natural laws of heaven and earth. There was no record that heavenly tribulations could have consciousness. Chu Fengmian didn't doubt it before. But since he tried to mobilize the power of heaven and earth in Tianjiu regions and failed to condense the celestial tribulation, he began to have some other guesses. At that time, the power of heaven and earth had been mobilized, but in the end, the tribulation clouds dissipated. Although all of this seemed to be due to insufficient power, Chu Fengmian felt that the tribulation clouds seemed to be controlled by someone and deliberately dissipated. Chu Fengmian came to the star cave. The sudden arrival of the celestial tribulation intensified Chu Fengmian's thoughts. Chapter 23:51. However, all of this was just Chu Fengmian's speculation. After all, controlling the heavenly tribulation was something that would shock the world. Even in Sword Emperor Crown's memories, no one had thought of such a thing. The heavenly tribulation was a tribulation that even immortal emperors had to face. It was said that after stepping into the immortal emperor level, there were 4 more great tribulations. After these 4 great tribulations, one would become the ruler. The heavenly tribulation was the rule of the heavenly Tao. This was something that no one had ever questioned. Who would have thought that there would be a voice in the middle of the Deva tribulation? Is this the voice of the heavenly Tao? Has the heavenly Tao given birth to a will? Or is someone controlling the heavenly tribulation? Countless thoughts appeared in Chu Fengmian's mind. However, before Chu Fengmian could continue thinking, a thunderbolt suddenly descended from the tribulation clouds. The color of this thunderbolt wasn't gold or black, but a unique gray. Chu Fengmian had only seen this gray in one thing: chaos. This gray color was the color of chaos. Chaos tribulation thunder? How is this possible? How can you trigger this thing? Isn't this the tribulation thunder that only immortal emperors would trigger? How can it appear in the Deva tribulation? Seeing the chaotic thunderbolt in the sky, Taichu's incredulous voice sounded in Chu Fengmian's mind. This tribulation thunder devoured. Chu Fengmian had never seen it before, but Taichu had. This was chaos tribulation thunder. Only during the chaos era, when the world had just been created and the 100 races had yet to be born, would there be tribulation thunder. It contained the power of chaos, and could be said to be one of the most powerful tribulation thunders. The first Sword Emperor had once been an immortal emperor. Taichu had followed the first Sword Emperor and had seen chaos tribulation thunder before. That was why he could recognize the origin of the chaos tribulation thunder at first glance. He never dreamed that Chu Fengmian's tribulation this time would only be the Deva tribulation, but there would be chaos tribulation thunder. This was a tribulation thunder that had killed countless immortal emperors. Even many immortal emperors had died under this tribulation thunder, let alone Chu Fengmian, who was only a half-step celestial being. Taichu couldn't understand why this was happening. Even with his experience, he couldn't understand this scene. Chaos tribulation thunder. It's chaos tribulation thunder. Chu Fengmian's expression changed abruptly. He could clearly feel the power of chaos contained within the tribulation thunder. Chu Fengmian had once devoured the qi of chaos, so he naturally knew about the power of chaos. The power of chaos contained within the tribulation lightning was so immense that Chu Fengmian had never seen it before. The chaos tribulation lightning was 1,000 times stronger than the destruction lightning. Although it was only a single bolt of primordial chaos tribulation lightning, the pressure it gave Chu Fengmian was 100, or even 1,000 times greater than when he had faced the thunder of destruction. Chu Fengmian's power began to tremble. This was the most dangerous tribulation he'd encountered ever since he'd crossed it. Thank goodness, it's a projection tribulation thunder. Chu Fengmian quickly calmed down. He had also noticed that the primal chaos tribulation lightning was not the real thing, but a projection. It should be a projection of the primal chaos tribulation lightning. This projection only had a 10,000th of the true power of the chaos tribulation lightning. Although it was dangerous for Chu Fengmian, it wasn't enough to make him despair. I might be able to withstand even a fraction of its power. Chu Fengmian's eyes flashed with fighting spirit. He was someone who died once. Now that he'd been reborn, there was nothing for him to be afraid of anymore. No matter how dangerous the situation was, it could only stimulate Chu Fengmian's fighting spirit and make him stronger. Ever since he'd defied the heavens and survived the Great Tribulation, Chu Fengmian had never thought of fear. Tai Chu. The titanic godly sword returned to Chu Fengmian's body. A brand new spiritual sword appeared in his right hand. It was the Taichu sword. Chu Fengmian didn't dare hold back in the face of chaos tribulation thunder. All he could do was give it his all. Rumble. Chaos tribulation thunder descended. It was only the size of a person, but as it descended, the surrounding space began to shatter. It was mercilessly crushed by the power of the tribulation thunder. Wherever the chaos tribulation lightning passed, space would shatter. Chu Fengmian's eyes flashed with incomparable solemnity. One had to know that this wasn't the 9 domains or the extraterritorial starry sky. This was the end of the starry cave, the place closest to the 3 great sacred domains. The laws of heaven and earth here were almost the same as the laws of heaven and earth in the 3 great sacred domains. The laws of heaven and earth of the 3 great sacred domains only peak immortal monarchs were qualified to break the space. But now, the tribulation thunder had shattered the space. This meant that the tribulation thunder's power had reached the level of a peak immortal monarch's strike, or even surpassed it. It was a one-hit kill. This tribulation thunder was the heavenly Tao's final strike against Chu Fengmian. It was also the last tribulation thunder of Chu Fengmian's Empyrean tribulation. When the tribulation thunder descended, the tribulation clouds above Chu Fengmian's head began to dissipate. It was obvious that the tribulation thunder had consumed all of the tribulation cloud's power to condense. Although it was the last one, it was also the most dangerous one for Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian had been staring at the tribulation thunder, accumulating sword intent on his sword. The moment the tribulation thunder descended in front of Chu Fengmian, the sword in his hand moved. Chu Fengmian's sword intent seemed to have merged with the Taichu sword in his hand. Within Chu Fengmian's body, the 2,815 supreme sword auras all flew out, bolstering the Taichu sword. This was the secret technique that Chu Fengmian learned from the Sword Emperor Crown to control supreme sword auras. Chu Fengmian poured all of his power into this sword. The ancient swordsmanship book appeared above Chu Fengmian's head. All of the sword intent comprehended in the ancient swordsmanship book erupted and condensed on this sword. 9 domains sword art. Sky Splitter. Chu Fengmian wanted to bet his life with the strongest sword he had created. Sky Splitter. Chu Fengmian roared. The spiritual sword in his hand suddenly slashed down and collided with the tribulation thunder. Rumble. Continuous explosions rang out crazily. The moment the Taichu sword collided with the tribulation thunder, Chu Fengmian's body couldn't withstand such tremendous power and began to crack. The 129,600 immortal crystals in his body were all covered in cracks and began to shatter. The Taichu sword could withstand the power of the tribulation thunder, but Chu Fengmian's body couldn't withstand it first. Such tremendous power wasn't something that Chu Fengmian could withstand. Chapter 23:52. In Chu Fengmian's body, the immortal crystals were shattering one after another. Even if Chu Fengmian pushed the power of his immortal true body to the extreme, and the endless life force from the divine tree poured into Chu Fengmian's body, he still couldn't repair the shattering of the immortal crystals. It wasn't that he couldn't repair them, but that the immortal crystals were shattering too quickly. It was so fast that even Chu Fengmian's divine tree couldn't keep up with the shattering speed. 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 crystals. Almost instantly, thousands of immortal crystals were completely shattered. No, once the immortal true body shatters, I'll be finished. Seeing this, Chu Fengmian was extremely anxious. He didn't expect that the immortal true body would be the first to collapse. It could be said that Chu Fengmian could fight above his level and even possess the power of an immortal lord at the half-step celestial realm because of the immortal true body. The immortal true body was one of Chu Fengmian's most important sources of power. But now, the immortal true body couldn't withstand the power and was about to shatter. Every immortal crystal was the source of power for the immortal true body. After tens of thousands of crystals shattered, Chu Fengmian felt the power in his body rapidly depleting. When resisting the chaos tribulation lightning, he was increasingly powerless. Chu Fengmian was even about to be swallowed by the chaos tribulation lightning. I'm destined to be invincible in this life. Even the heavenly path can't stop me. Chu Fengmian felt the changes in his body, and his eyes flashed with madness. He suddenly opened the empty ring, and countless elixirs immediately flew out of the ring. The moment Chu Fengmian opened the empty ring, thousands of elixirs flew out. Each of these elixirs contained an incomparably pure medicinal power. They were all elixirs that were at least at the level of an ancient sacred elixir. These were all elixirs of the body-refining path. Chu Fengmian had previously swept clean all the body-refining elixirs in Medicine King Valley. These elixirs were originally for Chu Fengmian to break through to the 5th level of the immortal true body. But now, he couldn't wait until then. Once the immortal true body was shattered by the destructive tribulation lightning, Chu Fengmian would die without a doubt. He couldn't wait until then. Now, Chu Fengmian's immortal true body had reached the limit of his control. Once it was upgraded, Chu Fengmian would feel powerless. It was like having power but not being able to control it, which was an extremely dangerous thing. Chu Fengmian was only half a step into the celestial being realm. He could barely control his current strength, but once his immortal true body advanced further, even Chu Fengmian himself was not confident that he could completely control the power of his immortal true body. There were many geniuses in history who were unable to control their own strength after obtaining a fortuitous encounter and ended up destroying themselves. Chu Fengmian also clearly understood the danger. Because of this, Chu Fengmian stopped the advancement of his undying body and didn't use these pills. But now, under the threat of the chaos tribulation thunder, Chu Fengmian had no other choice. He would rather lose control of his power than die under the tribulation thunder. Swallow the heavens! Chu Fengmian opened his mouth and channeled his devouring power, turning it into a huge black hole. The moment all the pills flew out of the empty ring, they flew into Chu Fengmian's mouth and were refined by the devouring power. All the pills were turned into incomparably pure medicinal efficacy, pouring into Chu Fengmian's body and being devoured by the 129,600 immortal crystals. In an instant, a huge amount of medicinal efficacy filled Chu Fengmian's body. The medicinal efficacy was so strong that it seemed to be about to burst his body. Hundreds of immortal pills and thousands of ancient saint pills. Such a huge amount of medicinal efficacy was enough to kill a celestial saint. Moreover, Chu Fengmian had the secret technique of devouring heaven, so the efficiency of refining the pills was much higher than that of other demon immortals. The medicinal efficacy that Chu Fengmian obtained from refining a pill was almost twice that of other demon immortals, and it was also hundreds of times faster than other demon immortals. Even the immortal pills couldn't last more than a few seconds under the influence of the devouring power. They were turned into pure medicinal efficacy and poured into Chu Fengmian's body. However, such a huge amount of medicinal efficacy poured into Chu Fengmian's body in an instant, and Chu Fengmian's body was about to explode. The power that a demon immortal cultivator could withstand was not unlimited. Once the medicinal efficacy was too much, he could really end up exploding and dying. Chu Fengmian's face changed in shock. He hurriedly controlled his power and suppressed the medicinal efficacy to prevent himself from exploding and dying. Even if Chu Fengmian's physical body was comparable to a real immortal master or even a celestial saint, it was still difficult for him to withstand such a huge amount of medicinal efficacy. The pills that Chu Fengmian swallowed in one breath were not just those that he obtained from Medicine King Valley. Chu Fengmian had killed the Demon Emperor, the Star Emperor, and the 7 peak immortal kings of the barren celestial star and obtained their empty rings. They were the real overlords and giants of the 7 major sections. Each of their empty rings contained a large number of sacred pills, immortal weapons, and so on. The harvest that Chu Fengmian obtained from the empty rings of the 7 people was no less than the harvest that Chu Fengmian had obtained from the Valley of the Medicine Masters. It was equivalent to obtaining the body-refining pills that the Valley of the Medicine Masters had accumulated. Therefore, this huge amount of medicinal efficacy was difficult for Chu Fengmian to deal with. However, under the threat of the Chaos Thunder, Chu Fengmian did not have the time to refine it bit by bit. The Chaos Thunder was destroying Chu Fengmian's immortal true body at every moment. In the end, it would destroy all of Chu Fengmian's immortal crystals and devour Chu Fengmian. In such a critical situation, Chu Fengmian could only devour it in the fastest way possible. The huge amount of medicinal efficacy was rampaging in Chu Fengmian's body. However, the situation was quickly alleviated. The 129,600 immortal crystals, after sensing the medicinal efficacy in Chu Fengmian's body, suddenly began to devour it in large mouthfuls. It was like a person who had been hungry for a long time and saw a feast. Especially those immortal crystals that were already broken, they were devouring the medicinal efficacy in a frenzy. Chu Fengmian had devoured countless sacred pills and refined them into medicinal efficacy using the sky-devouring secret technique. In an instant, a full 1/3 of the medicinal efficacy was devoured by the immortal crystals. After devouring such a large amount of medicinal efficacy, each immortal crystal became much more resilient. There were even some changes in power on it. These immortal crystals were already evolving in a new direction. Those immortal crystals that were already broken began to reform after devouring a large amount of medicinal efficacy. Chapter 23:53. The most terrifying thing about the immortal true body was its regenerative ability. It was because of its terrifying regenerative ability. That was why the immortal true body was known as immortal. Even the immortal crystals had been shattered by the Chaos Thunder. However, as long as there was enough medicinal power, the immortal crystals could be reconstructed and restored. Even now, the immortal crystals that had been reconstructed after absorbing the medicinal power had far surpassed their original state in terms of power. The medicinal power of hundreds of immortal pills and thousands of ancient sacred pills wasn't as simple as reconstructing the immortal crystals. It was also elevating their power. The immortal crystals that had been shattered by the Chaos Thunder had been reconstructed. A steady stream of power poured into Chu Fengmian's body, making him feel much more relaxed. However, all of this was just a quantitative change. Even a qualitative change required the immortal true body to improve. Now, the enormous medicinal power in Chu Fengmian's body could only reconstruct the immortal crystals that had been shattered by the chaos thunder. However, Chu Fengmian's immortal true body couldn't withstand the chaos thunder. New immortal crystals were being shattered every second. If this continued, Chu Fengmian would have to constantly consume the medicinal power to restore the broken immortal crystals. It was just a temporary solution. If this continued, no matter how much medicinal power Chu Fengmian had in his body, there would be a day when the medicinal power would be exhausted. It should be known that this time, Chu Fengmian had refined all the body-refining elixirs that he had accumulated all this time. If all the elixirs were consumed, then Chu Fengmian would have no other means to deal with them. Reconstructing the immortal crystals consumed an enormous amount of medicinal power. In a short time, 1/3 of the enormous medicinal power in Chu Fengmian's body had been consumed. With the Chaos Thunder's continuous bombardment, the medicinal power was devoured even more and was used to reconstruct the immortal crystals. If this continued, the medicinal power would be exhausted sooner or later. Chu Fengmian couldn't just sit and wait. Immortal! Upgrade! Chu Fengmian roared and pushed the power of the immortal crystals to the extreme. Suddenly, the 129,600 immortal crystals turned into a huge vortex, like a bottomless pit, crazily devouring the medicinal power in Chu Fengmian's body. All the medicinal power in Chu Fengmian's body was devoured. Every one of the 129,600 immortal crystals contained an enormous amount of power. This power had even reached the limit of the immortal crystals. The immortal crystals seemed to be unable to withstand such a huge force and began to shatter. However, Chu Fengmian didn't care about any of this. With a thought, the countless drops of blood essence stored in his immortal true body flew out. It was the blood essence of the Demon Emperor and the others. Chu Fengmian killed Demon Emperor and the others and swallowed their essence blood. He planned to use it to form the 5th immortal inscription. But now, he couldn't wait for that time. If he didn't get through this calamity, everything would be in vain. Such a huge amount of medicinal power poured into the immortal crystal, but it didn't make the immortal true body evolve. Now, he could only use the power of his blood essence. The moment the blood essence of Demon Emperor and the others flew out, it was instantly shattered by the power of devouring heaven and turned into incomparably pure immortal power. It poured into the 129,600 immortal crystals again. The Demon Emperor and the others were all existences at the pinnacle of the immortal king realm, especially the Demon Emperor. His blood essence was comparable to the blood essence of the immortal monarchs. Under the conversion of the heaven-devouring power, the blood essence was turned into the purest immortal power and poured into the 129,600 immortal crystals. The 129,600 immortal crystals had become incomparably violent after devouring a large amount of medicinal power. They also devoured the power of the blood essence. In an instant, many immortal crystals exploded all at once. Countless explosions sounded from Chu Fengmian's body. The explosions even wanted to blow Chu Fengmian's body to pieces. Chu Fengmian's expression didn't change at all. His mind controlled the exploding immortal crystals. The shattered immortal crystals were reformed under his control. Destroy and rebuild. Every time an immortal body leveled up, it was a metamorphosis. It had to be destroyed and rebuilt. However, compared to the last time, Chu Fengmian's upgrade this time was incomparably forceful. He didn't wait for the immortal crystals to shatter naturally. He used his powerful strength to forcibly make them explode. This was an extremely dangerous act. It could be said that the slightest carelessness would cause Chu Fengmian to die on the spot. The best result would be losing his immortal true body, and all his previous accumulations would go down the drain. However, under the threat of the Chaos Tribulation Lightning, Chu Fengmian had no choice but to go all out. After the immortal crystals exploded, They were reconstructed under Chu Fengmian's power. These reconstructed immortal crystals, compared to before the explosion, had already transformed. Inside each immortal crystal, there were even tiny lines that appeared, like the meridians of a human. Meridians? The fifth level of the immortal true body is to condense meridians? Chu Fengmian couldn't help but think. Every upgrade of the immortal true body brought about a metamorphosis. When Chu Fengmian reached the fourth level of the immortal true body, he gained the benefit of condensing inscriptions. Now it seemed that the fifth level of the immortal crystal was to condense meridians. He just didn't know what the meridians of the immortal true body were used for. A warrior's meridians were the spiritual meridians of a warrior. It was the initial aptitude of a warrior. A warrior without a spiritual meridians couldn't store spiritual power and couldn't cultivate. It was just like Chu Fengmian's previous life. Without a spiritual meridians, no matter how many methods the master of sword principle found, he couldn't cultivate Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian's rise in this life was closely related to the divine meridians that he condensed. The benefits that the divine meridians brought to Chu Fengmian were no less than any of the opportunities that he obtained. It could be said that the meridians of a warrior were the most important foundation of a warrior. Without a spiritual meridians, all aptitudes were in vain. Chu Fengmian didn't expect that the immortal true body would condense meridians. He just didn't know what the meridians were used for. However, apart from the transformation of the meridians, the power of the newly condensed immortal crystals was far greater than before. This was a true qualitative change. Chapter 23:54. Chu Fengmian's body had at least doubled in size as the originally shattered immortal crystals were reconstructed. This greatly reduced the pressure Chu Fengmian felt when facing the chaos tribulation lightning. Moreover, Chu Fengmian's physical strength continued to rise as more and more immortal crystals were reconstructed. Of the 129,600 immortal crystals, a total of 50,000 had been shattered and reconstructed. There were still a large number of immortal crystals waiting to be reconstructed. As long as they devoured enough immortal power, they would shatter and reconstruct one after another. The Chaos Tribulation Lightning was originally a danger Chu Fengmian would find difficult to deal with. But now, it had become the pressure for Chu Fengmian to ascend to the immortal true body. Every immortal crystal erupted with all its power at this moment, absorbing the power and beginning to transform. At every moment, large amounts of immortal crystals were transforming. In less than a minute, Chu Fengmian's body had become several times stronger than before, and his strength was still rising. Chu Fengmian could feel that if all 129,600 immortal crystals in his body transformed, Chu Fengmian's fleshly body would be 5 times stronger. Chu Fengmian was extremely shocked when he saw this result. The immortal true body was indeed the most powerful body refining method in the world. This upgrade had greatly improved Chu Fengmian's body. And this wasn't all of the improvements he'd received this time. After the immortal crystals transformed, something similar to human meridians appeared on them. There was nothing special about the meridians within the immortal crystals. However, the moment these 129,600 immortal crystals all transformed, the meridians would be able to display their usefulness. But now, the pressure on Chu Fengmian was greatly reduced even before all 129,600 immortal crystals had transformed. Vaguely, Chu Fengmian felt that his body could withstand the aftermath of the collision between the Taichu sword and the Chaos Tribulation Lightning. The Taichu sword was still the one that truly clashed with the Chaos Tribulation Lightning. His body only needed to withstand the aftermath of the collision between the two forces. Therefore, with the upgrade of his immortal true body, the aftermath of the collision was neutralized by the power of the immortal crystals when it bombarded Chu Fengmian's body. Now that his body could withstand the Chaos Tribulation Lightning, the greatest hidden danger was eliminated. Chu Feng Mian continued to use his immortal true body to absorb the energy from the remaining immortal crystals and continue to transform. On the other side, Chu Fengmian poured his power into the Taichu sword. He used the Taichu sword to attack the Chaos Lightning again. Previously, Chu Fengmian's body was unable to withstand the power of the Tribulation Lightning, so he could only passively take the beating. His swordsmanship and the power of the Taichu sword hadn't been fully activated yet. Now, it was time for Chu Fengmian to counterattack. Chu Fengmian wielded the Taichu sword and lashed out at the lightning bolts. Dragon might swept through everything as soon as he lashed out. When the sword slashed out, it transformed into a giant figure of Tianlong, slashing down with its sharp claws. 9 forms of the ancestor. Although Chu Fengmian possessed the bloodlines of 3 connate mythological beasts, he was most familiar with the power of progenitor Tianlong. All things become dragons. With Chu Fengmian's current control over the dragon origin, his sword could transform into a dragon. According to legend, the 8 primordial dragons were said to have inherited the bloodline of progenitor Tianlong, but in reality, they were only creatures created by progenitor Tianlong. Connate mythological beasts controlled the power of origin and had the means to create creatures. Although Chu Fengmian only controlled a part of the dragon origin and couldn't reach that level, his sword was already affected. He urged it to take the form of a dragon. The 2 forces clashed again. One could even hear roars coming from the Chaos Tribulation Lightning. It was as if the primordial Chaos Tribulation Lightning wanted to crush Chu Fengmian to death, to drown him with destructive power. However, Chu Fengmian wasn't afraid at all. His sword flashed again and again, clashing with the Tribulation Lightning. After thousands of clashes, both Chu Fengmian and the Tribulation Lightning wanted to completely defeat and devour the other. With each clash, Chu Fengmian's response became more and more relaxed. More and more of the 129,600 immortal crystals in his body had transformed. A total of 110,000 immortal crystals had all transformed. The transformation of each immortal crystal gave Chu Fengmian an even stronger power. While clashing with the Tribulation Lightning, Chu Fengmian's power was rising steadily at every moment. However, the Tribulation Lightning's power was being consumed little by little, becoming weaker and weaker. Before, Chu Fengmian was barely able to deal with the Tribulation Lightning's attacks, but now, he was able to counterattack repeatedly. And within Chu Fengmian's body, there was a large piece of undying crystal. It had already devoured enough power, transforming completely at this moment. 120,000. Another 10,000 immortal crystals had all transformed, increasing Chu Fengmian's strength by another 10%. The heavenly Tao will not tolerate this. Rumble. Another cold harumph suddenly echoed within the Chaos Tribulation Lightning. The voice that rang out this time was much clearer than the previous time. Even Chu Fengmian could hear the anger in the voice. Sure enough, this heavenly tribulation has been controlled by someone. That's why it can erupt with such terrifying power. Now that Chu Fengmian had transcended the great Empyrean tribulation, his power had already exceeded the normal range. Since ancient times, some monstrous geniuses had to face the dangers of the heavenly tribulation when they transcended their tribulations. Compared to ordinary warriors, there was a limit. At most, it was about 100 times the danger of the heavenly tribulation. Almost all the geniuses since ancient times were at this level. However, the great Empyrean tribulation Chu Fengmian was facing now was tens of thousands of times more powerful than an ordinary one. It had far exceeded the limit. Now, with this angry roar, Chu Fengmian could clearly feel that the Tribulation Lightning's power was still rising steadily. Someone is transferring power to the Tribulation Lightning. Elder Fan suddenly exclaimed. The sudden increase in the power of the primal Chaos Tribulation Lightning greatly surprised him. The heavenly tribulation's power had always been constant. Once the tribulation cloud's power disappeared, the tribulation would end. In order to condense the tribulation lightning, all the tribulation cloud's power had been consumed. Chapter 23:55. This chaos tribulation lightning should be the last tribulation lightning. Yet now, someone was actually transferring power to the primal chaos tribulation lightning. This had broken the rules since time immemorial. Someone was actually controlling the tribulation. The person controlling the tribulation was determined to kill Chu Fengmian today. He didn't hesitate to transfer power to the tribulation lightning from a distant place. With the continuous transfer of power, the tribulation lightning recovered all the power it had consumed, even surpassing when it had first formed. Moreover, the tribulation lightning's power continued to grow, as if there was no upper limit. If this tribulation lightning continues to grow, I'll die without a doubt. I must find out who is transferring power to him. Chu Fengmian's expression was grim. If the tribulation lightning continued to grow, Chu Fengmian would no longer have any hope of resisting it. He'd already used all his trump cards, even going as far as to forcibly break through to the 5th level of the immortal true body, just to barely resist the tribulation lightning. But if the tribulation lightning's power continued to grow, Chu Fengmian would truly be doomed. His top priority was to find out the source of the tribulation lightning's power. Tianlong! Chu Fengmian roared, channeling the power of primogenitor Tianlong and looking at the surrounding space. The tribulation lightning's source couldn't have come for no reason. It must have come from somewhere. In the blink of an eye, Chu Fengmian saw the layers of space around him clearly. However, there were so many layers that he couldn't explore them all at once. There were more than one layer of space. For example, the space of the 9 regions was composed of many layers. In fact, there were hundreds of layers. This was the star hole, the place where 2 universes had collided. Layers of space that had been crushed by the 2 universes floated in the hole. Chu Fengmian looked around and saw almost 1,000 layers of space. Chu Fengmian had to find the source of the tribulation lightning's power. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but Chu Fengmian had no other choice. Only by cutting off the source of the tribulation lightning's power would he have a chance of defeating it. Chu Fengmian's spiritual sense was pushed to the extreme. It swept through dozens of layers of space in an instant. However, this was just a drop in the ocean of thousands of layers of complex space. As Chu Fengmian investigated, he also had to deal with the bombardment of the chaos tribulation lightning. As the chaos lightning grew stronger and stronger, it was no longer as easy for Chu Fengmian to deal with it as it was before. Wielding the Taichu sword was extremely taxing for Chu Fengmian in the first place. Even with the recovery of his divine pulse, Chu Fengmian's power was about to run out. This was even after Chu Fengmian had consumed countless immortal pills to recover his strength. If this continued, Chu Fengmian might not be able to find the source of the chaos tribulation lightning. Chu Fengmian's power would be exhausted first. Anxiety appeared on Chu Fengmian's face. He, who had always been calm and composed, was starting to get anxious. The danger of the celestial tribulation this time was far beyond Chu Fengmian's expectations. Even though Chu Fengmian had made so many preparations, he still fell into danger. Rumble! Chaos to devour. The tribulation lightning struck down once again. Holding the Taichu sword, Chu Fengmian resisted the might of the sword, but he was still forced to retreat. Chu Fengmian's power was almost exhausted. It was difficult for him to resist the bombardment of the chaos lightning. Is it not done yet? While Chu Fengmian fought the tribulation lightning, he was also waiting for his immortal true body to completely transform. The 129,600 immortal crystals had transformed into 129,600 immortal crystals. There were only 600 crystals left that hadn't transformed. These 600 immortal crystals seemed to be a threshold. These 600 immortal crystals had already devoured several times the power of the other crystals, but they still hadn't transformed. It seemed that this threshold was incomparably difficult to cross. Chu Fengmian had already tossed all the wondrous items he'd obtained from his spatial ring to his immortal true body. As long as it was something that could be devoured and refined by the immortal crystal, it would be devoured by the immortal crystal. At this point, Chu Fengmian couldn't care less about the value of these wondrous items. Once he died, it wouldn't matter how many things he left behind. Just as the immortal crystal devoured all of Chu Fengmian's wondrous items to the last drop, the last 600 immortal crystals finally began to transform. One by one, the immortal crystals condensed meridian patterns similar to those of a human body. In the end, all 600 immortal crystals transformed. Rumble. The moment all 129,600 immortal crystals transformed, Chu Fengmian's power reached a whole new level. Chu Fengmian's immortal true body had finally ascended to the 5th level. His originally extremely weak strength was instantly restored. Holding the Taichu sword in hand, he suddenly slashed at the chaotic tribulation lightning, shattering the bolts of lightning in an instant. At the same time, Chu Fengmian also felt that his power was endless. Even activating the Taichu sword didn't consume much of his power. This is? Rumble. Another cold harumph suddenly echoed within the chaos tribulation lightning. The voice that rang out this time was much clearer than the previous time. Even Chu Fengmian could hear the anger in the voice. As expected, the tribulation has been controlled by someone. That's why it can erupt with such terrifying power. Chu Fengmian's power after transcending the great tribulation of the Empyrean realm had already exceeded the normal range. Since ancient times, some monstrous geniuses had to face the dangers of the heavenly tribulation when they transcended their tribulations. Compared to ordinary warriors, there was a limit. At most, it was about 100 times the danger of the heavenly tribulation. Almost all geniuses since ancient times had been at this level. However, the great tribulation of the Empyrean realm that Chu Fengmian was facing now was tens of thousands of times more powerful than an ordinary one. It had far surpassed the limit. Now, following the angry roar, Chu Fengmian could clearly sense that the tribulation lightning's power was still rising steadily. Someone is transferring power to the tribulation lightning. Elder Fan suddenly exclaimed. The sudden increase in the tribulation lightning's power took him by surprise. The tribulation's power had always been constant. Once the tribulation cloud's power disappeared, the tribulation would end. In order to condense the tribulation lightning, all of the tribulation cloud's power had been consumed. Chapter 2356. The ascension of the immortal true body to the 5th level brought Chu Fengmian a qualitative leap. The power that Chu Fengmian lacked the most in the fight against the chaos tribulation lightning was now completely made up for. Chu Fengmian held the Taichu sword in his hand. This time, he didn't have to worry about the consumption of power when he activated the blade. Chu Fengmian's power was 100 times stronger than before, and he displayed his sword skills without restraint. Chu Fengmian's blade flashed, and suddenly dozens of sword skills burst out. If Chu Fengmian had unleashed dozens of sword skills in the past, his spiritual power would have been completely drained. But now, Chu Fengmian could use dozens of sword skills with ease. He could even mobilize his spiritual consciousness to scan the surrounding space the moment he attacked. The dozens of sword skills bombarded down, firmly suppressing the power of the chaos tribulation lightning. This also allowed Chu Fengmian to free himself and search the surrounding space for the source of the chaos tribulation lightning. Chu Fengmian's figure flashed and directly escaped into the depths of the void. He fully unfolded his spiritual consciousness and explored all the layers of space. Just when Chu Fengmian had explored hundreds of layers of space in succession, a sudden force caught his attention. This force was hidden in the gap between the two layers of space, and ordinary people wouldn't be able to detect it. Only when Chu Fengmian was very close did he discover this power. His eyes turned cold. Suddenly, a thought passed through his mind. A couple of huge dragon claws were formed above his head and suddenly clawed forward. Rumble! The moment the dragon claws clawed at it, the force suddenly burst out and revealed its true form from the hidden space. Only then did Chu Fengmian see that it was a spatial tunnel. This spatial tunnel was connected to the Chaos Tribulation Lightning, and the source of the Chaos Tribulation Lightning's power was this spatial tunnel. The other end of the spatial tunnel extended to the three sacred realms, but because it was too far away, Chu Fengmian couldn't detect who was at the other end of the spatial tunnel even if he concentrated all his spiritual consciousness. However, this spatial tunnel extended from at least tens of millions of miles away. Such means. Chu Fengmian's face was incomparably gloomy. This kind of method was already beyond the scope of what Chu Fengmian could deal with right now. Not even the celestial sage, who was stronger than Chu Fengmian, could have such means. The laws of heaven and earth in the three sacred domains were incomparably strong. To open up a spatial passageway thousands of miles away from the three sacred domains was a method that was simply shocking. Only an immortal venerable or even an invincible immortal emperor could do something like this. Chu Fengmian didn't expect that he would be targeted and devoured by an expert of this level. However, this person was extremely cautious when he attacked. It was as if he did not want to reveal his identity. Otherwise, there would be no need for him to use the primal chaos tribulation lightning to kill Chu Fengmian. If he had attacked directly, it would have been even more difficult for Chu Fengmian to resist. Let's sever this spatial tunnel first. Chu Fengmian was as calm as ever. Even though he knew that he was being targeted, it would be better for him to deal with the tribulation lightning first before doing anything else. Once Chu Fengmian stepped into the celestial realm, his strength would advance by leaps and bounds. At that time, Chu Fengmian would be able to contend with a real expert. The current power of the primal chaos tribulation lightning came from this spatial tunnel. Once the spatial tunnel was severed, the tribulation lightning would lose its source of power. Sword. After finding the spatial tunnel, Chu Fengmian didn't need to use any other means. He could directly break it with brute force. The sword in his hand flashed and slashed fiercely at the spatial tunnel. This spatial tunnel was hidden very deeply. It was because such spatial tunnels were usually very fragile that they were deliberately hidden. Chu Fengmian slashed out with his sword. A sword chi slashed down, causing the spatial tunnel to tremble violently. "Brat, you deserve to die!" Hong. An angry roar was heard from the spatial tunnel. It was the same voice that Chu Fengmian heard from the primal chaos tribulation lightning. The person who opened the spatial tunnel was indeed the one who controlled the heavenly tribulation. Following the angry roar, more power burst out from the spatial tunnel. It seemed to envelop Chu Fengmian's body and completely destroy him. However, Chu Fengmian wasn't afraid at all. He slashed down with his sword again. In an instant, Chu Fengmian had activated the Taichu sword more than 100 times. Crack. Over 100 sword chi slashed at one spot at the same time. Finally, the spatial tunnel couldn't withstand the sword chi and completely shattered. At the moment when the spatial tunnel shattered, an angry roar was heard. "Brat, don't ever step into the three sacred realms if you dare. The moment you step into the three sacred realms, it will be the day of your death." The angry roar disappeared along with the spatial tunnel that was shattered by the sword chi before it could finish speaking. However, those words were still heard by Chu Fengmian. A bluff. Chu Fengmian's lips curled into a cold smile. After a few exchanges, Chu Fengmian was able to see one thing. Although the person behind the spatial tunnel was extremely powerful, he seemed to be restricted by something and couldn't make a move. Otherwise, given the person's strength, even an attack that spanned millions of miles would be able to seriously injure Chu Fengmian. However, he didn't make a move against Chu Fengmian until the spatial tunnel shattered. It wasn't that he didn't want to, but that he couldn't do it. Therefore, he could only kill Chu Fengmian with a borrowed knife. He was prepared to use the power of the Chaos Tribulation to kill Chu Fengmian, but in the end, he failed. Since he couldn't make a move, Chu Fengmian didn't fear him no matter how strong he was. It would be fine as long as Chu Fengmian didn't give him the opportunity to kill Chu Fengmian with a borrowed knife. Therefore, Chu Fengmian didn't care about the threat at all. Moreover, Chu Fengmian wasn't the kind of person who would be threatened. If he didn't dare to go to the 3 sacred realms when he was threatened, how could he be considered a powerhouse and invincible? A truly invincible powerhouse was fearless. No matter how great the threat, they wouldn't be afraid at all. The person behind the scenes has been dealt with. All that's left is the Chaos Tribulation Lightning. Chu Fengmian dealt with the spatial tunnel and cut off the power source of the Chaos Tribulation Lightning. The power of the Chaos Tribulation Lightning began to weaken. Originally, the power of the Chaos Tribulation Lightning should have been completely exhausted. It was just that the spatial tunnel was continuously transmitting power. Now that the spatial tunnel was cut off, the power of the Chaos Tribulation Lightning was no longer a threat to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian's eyes flashed with greed when he looked at the Chaos Tribulation Lightning. Chapter 23:57. I can't let such a force go to waste. Although the Chaos Tribulation Lightning was weak, the power it contained was enough to destroy an immortal. It would have been difficult for Chu Fengmian to deal with it before he attained the immortal real body. It would be a waste to destroy such a great force. The essence of the Chaos Tribulation Lightning was the power of creation. Chu Fengmian's natal sword origin fed on the power of creation. Although the Chaos Tribulation Lightning was strong, it wasn't impossible for Chu Fengmian to devour it. Sky devouring. The heaven-devouring beast shadow behind Chu Fengmian suddenly roared and opened its mouth, swallowing the primal Chaos Tribulation Lightning in one gulp. Crackle! The Chaos Tribulation Lightning fell into Chu Fengmian's body and erupted with power, trying to tear his body apart. However, Chu Fengmian's body was completely different from before. The 129,600 immortal crystals had all evolved to the 5th level, making his body 5 times stronger than before. It could be said that Chu Fengmian's body was tougher than most immortal weapons. No matter how the Chaos Tribulation Lightning exploded, its power was divided and dissolved by the 129,600 immortal crystals. At the same time, Chu Fengmian's natal sword origin, the sword of creation formed by the power of creation, flew out and entered the Chaos Tribulation Lightning to devour it. The power of the Chaos Tribulation Lightning was far above Chu Fengmian's natal sword origin. However, the primal Chaos Tribulation Lightning was suppressed by Chu Fengmian's power all the time. Its power was less than 10%. Although the natal sword origin couldn't devour the primal Chaos Tribulation Lightning in one go, it could devour its power bit by bit. In a few breaths, 1% of the Chaos Tribulation Lightning's power had been devoured by the natal sword origin. Although it wasn't fast, Chu Fengmian wasn't in a hurry. He urged the natal sword origin to devour the power of the Chaos Tribulation Lightning bit by bit. Once the Chaos Tribulation Lightning was completely devoured, it would mean the end of Chu Fengmian's celestial tribulation. At that time, Chu Fengmian could truly step into the celestial realm. Chu Fengmian stood in the middle of the star cavern, focusing all of his attention on urging his natal sword energy to devour the Chaos Lightning. But at this moment, Chu Fengmian suddenly felt a trace of danger. He immediately came to his senses and abruptly condensed his sword intent. But at this moment, a sword suddenly slashed at Chu Fengmian's back without making a sound. Buzz. The sword was silent. Even Chu Fengmian only reacted when the tip of the sword approached him. Boom. The sword pierced through Chu Fengmian's immortal body's defense and stabbed into his body. Jiuyu. However, the moment the sword pierced Chu Fengmian's body, Chu Fengmian also fiercely countered with his sword. The power of the stars burst out and immediately turned into a sword chi galaxy, sweeping towards the direction of the sword attack. A figure was immediately drawn into the sword chi galaxy. At this moment, Chu Fengmian suddenly saw that the person who had unleashed the sword was actually a young man. The young man's appearance was extremely ordinary and unremarkable, but there was an extremely terrifying sword intent between his eyebrows. The young man fell into the sword chi galaxy, but he didn't panic. Suddenly, the sword in his hand flashed, and a golden light flickered and turned into a sword edge. With a slash of the sword chi galaxy was torn apart by the sword. Who is this person? Chu Fengmian's expression changed. His sword chi galaxy had actually been broken by this young man so easily. Moreover, Chu Fengmian didn't even notice this young man's sneak attack just now. This was the Star Cavern, where the space was extremely unstable and difficult to detect. But it was almost impossible for ordinary peak immortal kings or even immortal monarchs to get close to Chu Fengmian. But this young man avoided all of Chu Fengmian's probing, especially when Chu Fengmian noticed that this young man was only an immortal marquis. He was only an immortal marquis. Along the way, Chu Fengmian had killed countless immortal kings and peak stage immortal kings. In Chu Fengmian's eyes, immortal marquises were like ants. Even Chu Fengmian wasn't willing to fight against immortal marquises. This time, he suffered a great loss in the hands of an immortal marquis. Chu Fengmian could see that this young man wasn't an ordinary immortal marquis. Like Chu Fengmian, his true strength was far beyond his realm. Chu Fengmian even felt that this young man's strength was stronger than Demon Monarch. His strength had definitely reached the immortal monarch level, and even among the immortal monarchs, he was an extremely tyrannical existence. Apart from Chu Fengmian himself, this was the first time he saw such a terrifying figure. Where did such a person come from? Furthermore, this person came specifically for me. Chu Fengmian's eyes flashed with shock. Demon Monarch was already the most dazzling genius Chu Fengmian had ever seen, but compared to this young man, he was still far behind. One had to know that the lower the realm, the stronger the strength, and the more terrifying the future achievements. An existence that was invincible in the same realm, even if he stepped into the immortal venerable or immortal emperor in the future, would be an incomparably terrifying expert. Such a person would be nurtured as a genius in the three great saint domains. Such a person definitely wasn't an unknown person. But Chu Fengmian didn't remember provoking such a person. Who are you? Why did you sneak attack me? Chu Fengmian stared at the young man, as if he wanted to find some clues about this person from him. You don't have the right to know who I am. The young man spoke with an extremely arrogant tone. He sized up Chu Fengmian and slowly said, "To think that there would be someone like you in the lower world. It's a pity that you've bumped into me today. Hand over the supreme sword chi and all of the serendipity on you. If you do, I can consider sparing your life and making you my slave to serve me." The young man's words were arrogant to the extreme, but Chu Fengmian was still able to pick up some clues from his words. The lower realm. These two words were not ordinary at all. In Sword Emperor Guan's memory, one of the three great saint domains names for the outer realm was the lower realm. This was because in the eyes of many experts in the three great saint domains, now that the spatial tunnel was cut off, the power of the chaotic tribulation lightning was no longer a threat to Chu Fengmian. The moment Chu Fengmian looked at the chaotic tribulation lightning, his eyes flashed with greed. Chapter 23:58. The young man's title meant that he didn't belong to the extraterritorial starry sky. He was at least an expert from the three great sacred domains or even the 9 domains. Judging from his tone, he was probably a famous genius expert even in the three great sacred domains. However, Chu Fengmian had never been to the three great sacred domains. In the Sword Emperor Crown's memory, His understanding of the three great sacred domains was still maintained from tens of millions of years ago. The genius experts from tens of millions of years ago had probably fallen under the long river of time. Even if there were still people who could survive, they would definitely be immortal venerables or immortal emperors. They definitely wouldn't be this young man. Chu Fengmian and the three great sacred domains didn't have any enmity, but the young man in front of him clearly came for Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian observed the young man and suddenly felt a familiar feeling. When he thought of the young man's words just now, Chu Fengmian's eyes suddenly revealed a bit of enlightenment. Supreme Sword Qi? You came for the Supreme Sword Qi? Chu Fengmian felt the existence of Supreme Sword Qi from the young man's body. Supreme Sword Qi had the effect of mutual attraction. Originally, Chu Fengmian didn't notice it, but when the young man stood in front of Chu Fengmian suddenly discovered that there was Supreme Sword Qi on this person's body. Moreover, the power fluctuation of this person's Supreme Sword Qi was even stronger than Chu Fengmian's. There were a total of 3,000 Supreme Sword Qi. Now, Chu Fengmian had a total of 2,815 of them in his hands. Logically speaking, even if the other Supreme Sword Qi were all obtained by others, there would only be 185 left. It was far from being comparable to the Supreme Sword Qi in Chu Fengmian's hands. However, the power emitted from this young man's body, the Supreme Sword Qi that this person controlled, in terms of power, was even devouring. It was even more tyrannical than Chu Fengmian. The Supreme Sword Qi on Chu Fengmian's body seemed to be suppressed under the aura of this young man. It was so illogical, but there was only one possibility. That was, this young man's body had the King Sword Qi, the most powerful among the Supreme Sword Qi. There were 3,000 Supreme Sword Qis. The might of each of the 3,000 Supreme Sword Qis was almost on par. However, the first Supreme Sword Qi was an exception. This Supreme Sword Qi was the leader of the remaining 2,999 Supreme Sword Qis. It was known as the King Sword Qi. It was said that the Supreme Sword formation set up by the Upper Sword sect was set up with the King's Sword Qi as the core. This King Sword Qi was the true core of the Supreme Sword formation. Without the King's Sword Qi, even though Chu Fengmian had already mastered 2,815 strands of Supreme Sword Qi, he was still far from being able to unleash the power of the Supreme Sword formation. Chu Fengmian had been searching for this King Sword Qi but to no avail. Now it seemed that the King Sword Qi must have fallen into the hands of this young man. It was precisely because he controlled the King's Sword Qi in his hands that it gave Chu Fengmian such a huge sense of oppression. You're quite a smart person. This makes this exalted feel more and more reluctant to kill you. The young man smiled when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. Kneel down. Kneel down and become a slave. That is your final destination. Follow me and I will bestow you with unparalleled power. The lower world you came from is merely a remote place. Following me is your best choice. The young man stared at Chu Fengmian. Although his tone was calm, the arrogance in his voice showed that he wasn't afraid at all. When he looked at Chu Fengmian, he didn't see Chu Fengmian as a threat, but as an ant that he could crush at any time. Anger flashed in Chu Fengmian's eyes. Ever since he obtained the inheritance of the Supreme Sword sect, he had shaken the 9 regions. Even the 7 great sects considered Chu Fengmian a great enemy. However, no one dared to look down on Chu Fengmian. You sure talk big. Let's see what you're capable of. Chu Fengmian stared at the young man and said coldly, I've already killed more than one person from the 3 Saint Realms. Killing you won't make any difference. As soon as the young man arrived, he launched a sneak attack on Chu Fengmian without any explanation. In Chu Fengmian's eyes, the young man was already a dead man. No matter how noble his identity was, he couldn't avoid the death penalty today. It didn't matter who came. For Chu Fengmian, no matter what the other party's identity was, as long as they dared to stand on the opposite side of Chu Fengmian, there would only be one result: to be killed by Chu Fengmian. You're just a frog in a well. Do you think I'm the same as those trash? Hearing Chu Fengmian's words, the young man was so angry that he laughed. It's your honor to be my slave, but you don't know how to cherish it. Very well, it's been a long time since someone dared to disobey me. I haven't fought for a long time. Even an ant from the lower world dares to provoke me. Remember, my name is Young Master Zero Jian. I'm the one who will kill you. As he spoke, the young man suddenly made a move. A golden spirit sword condensed in his palm and slashed at Chu Fengmian. The golden spiritual sword didn't have a physical body, but Chu Fengmian could see that it was a spiritual sword condensed from pure sword intent. With such a sword intent, the young man called Young Master Zero Jian's sword attainment was even higher than that of an immortal monarch or even a celestial saint. As soon as he attacked, the sky changed color. Sword light appeared everywhere, containing a murderous aura, slashing at Chu Fengmian from all directions. Young Master Zero Jian's sword intent was fully displayed at this moment. It was a sword of absolute killing. His sword was born to kill. It was ferocious everywhere. Sword intent rushed out from his body, shrouding the entire space with countless sword edges. For a moment it made people tremble with fear. Although young noble Zero Jian was only an immortal marquis, his strength was at least on par with the Devil Emperor. His attainments in the Sword Dao surpassed the Devil Emperor's attainments in the Martial Dao. The strength he could unleash was even greater than the Devil Emperor's. Sword break. The moment young Master Zero Jian attacked, Chu Fengmian also took out the Taichu sword and slashed out. Even Chu Fengmian had never seen young Master Zero Jian's Sword Dao. In the 9 domains there were Sword Daos that made a living by killing people. However, none of those Sword Daos could be compared to young Master Zero Jian's Sword Dao. Young Master Zero Jian's sword technique was profound enough to surpass the immortal Emperor's Sword Dao. The person who created this Sword Dao was not inferior to Chu Fengmian in terms of Sword Dao attainment. He was definitely a person who was half a step away from the origin of Sword Dao. Chapter 2359. Chu Fengmian originally thought that his attainments in Sword Dao had surpassed the immortal Emperor realm and was the closest to the origin of Sword Dao. However, he didn't expect that the creator of young Master Zero Jian's swordsmanship wasn't inferior to Chu Fengmian in terms of Sword Dao. This made Chu Fengmian realize that he had been viewing the sky from the bottom of a well. Chu Fengmian's Sword Dao attainments were indeed unrivaled in the 9 domains and the extraterrestrial starry sky. However, in the 3 sacred domains and even the 9 domains, there might be someone who could compete with Chu Fengmian in Sword Dao. At the very least, the creator of young Master Zero Jian's swordsmanship was qualified to compete with Chu Fengmian in Sword Dao. Young Master Zero Jian's swordsmanship should only be a part of the swordsmanship, but it had already surpassed Chu Fengmian's immortal Emperor swordsmanship. Yin Yang. Amethyst. The sword in Chu Fengmian's hand flashed as he struck out twice in succession, barely clashing with young Master Zero Jian's swordsmanship. The power of young Master Zero Jian's swordsmanship wasn't inferior to Chu Fengmian's. Moreover, his strength was superior to Chu Fengmian's. This was the first time that Chu Fengmian didn't have an absolute advantage in swordsmanship when facing young Master Zero Jian. Not bad. Is this the swordsmanship of the Supreme Sword Sect? It's really extraordinary. Young Master Zero Jian looked at Chu Fengmian's swordsmanship and slowly said, "It's true that such an inheritance would be buried in the hands of the lower realm. However, it's only in the hands of me, young Master Zero Jian, that the inheritance of the upper sword sect can be truly displayed. Brat, I'm giving you one last chance. Either you submit or you die." Young Master Zero Jian looked at Chu Fengmian indifferently. Although he had fought with Chu Fengmian once, young Master Zero Jian still looked at Chu Fengmian with contempt. He didn't put Chu Fengmian in his eyes. You talk too much nonsense. Chu Fengmian didn't want to waste his breath on young Master Zero Jian. Given Chu Fengmian's character, he would rather die than surrender as a slave. Moreover, young Master Zero Jian didn't have the qualifications to make Chu Fengmian submit. With a flash of his sword, he once again slashed towards young Noble Zero Sword. Chu Fengmian slashed out with the countless swordsmanship he had obtained from the Shang sword sect. You're seeking death. Hearing Chu Fengmian's refusal, young Noble Zero Jian's eyes flashed with anger. With his status, even in the three great holy realms, everyone was respectful to him. No one dared to look down on his majesty. In his eyes, Chu Fengmian was just an ant from the lower world. He was not even comparable to his usual servants. He wanted to take Chu Fengmian as his servant because he saw that Chu Fengmian had some attainments in the way of the sword. In his opinion, this was already a supreme reward for Chu Fengmian, yet Chu Fengmian actually refused him. Ignorant ant from the lower realms, I will grant you death. Young Master Zero Jian shouted coldly, and his sword suddenly moved. The sword in his hand changed, and unexpectedly, it became invisible. The sword in his hand had disappeared without a trace. However, Chu Fengmian could clearly feel that the sword intent from young Master Zero Jian was still present. This is? Chu Fengmian instinctively felt a bit of danger, and his figure suddenly retreated. At the place where Chu Fengmian was just standing, a sword edge had already slashed down without anyone noticing. If not for Chu Fengmian's quick reaction, he would have been killed by the sword. With young Master Zero Jian's strength, Chu Fengmian's immortal true body could hardly withstand it. If Chu Fengmian was hit by this sword, he would either die or be seriously injured. Even I can't see through this person's swordsmanship? Chu Fengmian frowned. When facing other sword cultivators, Chu Fengmian could see through their swordsmanship in an instant. Therefore, Chu Fengmian had a great advantage when facing sword cultivators. However, in front of young Master Zero Jian, Chu Fengmian's advantage in the way of the sword was infinitely reduced. Especially when Chu Fengmian couldn't see the sword's trajectory clearly. Although it was called an invisible sword, it was actually a kind of camouflage, but Chu Fengmian couldn't see through it. You're quite capable to be able to dodge this sword. While Chu Fengmian's brows were tightly knitted, young Master Zero Jian's expression was incomparably relaxed. He looked at Chu Fengmian with a somewhat playful expression. I wonder how many more swords you can dodge. Just as young Master Zero Jian spoke, Chu Fengmian instinctively felt a sense of crisis, and his figure hurriedly moved to the left. At the place where Chu Fengmian was just a moment ago, another sword silently slashed down. This time, Chu Fengmian still couldn't see the sword's trajectory clearly. If not for Chu Fengmian's instinctive reaction, he wouldn't have been able to dodge this sword. What's going on with this person's swordsmanship? Why can't I see through it? Chu Fengmian was fully focused, trying to see through the sword's trajectory. But this time, Chu Fengmian still couldn't see through the sword's trajectory. Instead, Chu Fengmian couldn't dodge in time, and his arm was cut by the sword. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian dodged in time, and the sword only tore a small wound on his arm. But for Chu Fengmian, his expression was incomparably dignified. The speed of this sword was much faster than before. It was so fast that Chu Fengmian couldn't dodge it by relying on his instincts. This young Master Zero Jian seemed to be toying with Chu Fengmian, deliberately increasing the speed of his sword bit by bit to kill Chu Fengmian. I, Chu Fengmian, am actually being looked down upon. Chu Fengmian's eyes were somewhat cold. Even when he had just risen, Chu Fengmian had never been looked down upon like this. He had never been toyed with like this. If young Master Zero Jian had used his full strength in the first sword, Chu Fengmian wouldn't have been able to block it, but he was deliberately increasing his strength bit by bit. Moreover, he had surpassed the Demon Emperor's attainments in martial arts, and the strength he displayed was even stronger than the Demon Emperor. Sword break. The moment Zero Jian attacked, Chu Fengmian also took out the Taichu sword and slashed out. Even Chu Fengmian had never seen Zero Jian's sword Dao. In the 9 domains there were sword Daos that made a living by killing people. However, none of those sword principles could compare to the sword principle unleashed by the Zero sword. Zero Jian's sword technique was mysterious enough to surpass the immortal emperor's sword Dao. The person who created this sword Dao wasn't inferior to Chu Fengmian in terms of sword Dao attainment. He was definitely a figure who was half a step away from the origin of sword Dao. Chapter 2360. More than half of Chu Fengmian's strength was used to suppress the Chaos Tribulation Lightning. Therefore, he was powerless against young Master Zero Jian. Boom! While Chu Fengmian was still pondering, another beam of sword light came slashing at Chu Fengmian. 3 Suns Blazing Sword. Chu Fengmian moved the Taichu sword in his hand, condensing a supreme flame. He suddenly slashed out, creating a sea of fire in front of Chu Fengmian. It collided with the invisible sword. 3 Suns Blazing Sword? The sword technique of the number 1 Sword Emperor? Young Master Zero Jian looked at Chu Fengmian's sword with a hint of surprise in his eyes. Chu Fengmian had mastered the sword technique of the number 1 Sword Emperor and had used it countless times in the 9 domains. However, no one could see the true origin of this sword technique. However, young Master Zero Jian recognized it at a glance. This person's attainment in sword Dao was far beyond those sword techniques in the 9 domains. Young Master Zero Jian's eyes revealed a hint of surprise when he saw Chu Fengmian's 3 Suns Blazing Sword. I didn't expect you to not only inherit the sword technique of the Supreme Sword Sect, but also the sword technique of the number 1 Sword Emperor. You're really lucky. Unfortunately, you met me today. All of your opportunities will belong to me. Young Master Zero Jian swung his sword, and a dazzling sword light burst out, immediately hitting the sea of fire. Suddenly, the sea of fire was shattered by young Master Zero Jian's sword. Another sword technique? Chu Fengmian's eyes suddenly shrunk. Young Master Zero Jian had used a 3rd sword technique in a short period of time. Within a short period of time, young Master Zero Sword had already performed 3 different sword techniques. The first sword technique contained the Tao of Slaughter. It was a sword technique that contained boundless slaughter. The second sword technique was the invisible sword technique. As for the 3rd sword technique, it was a sword technique with extreme power. The profoundness of these 3 sword techniques was completely different. Even the sword Dao they contained could be said to be completely opposite. However, each of the sword techniques displayed by young Master Zero contained incomparably terrifying power. Chu Fengmian had some doubts about young Master Zero Jian's origin. How could he know so many sword techniques? Moreover, each of these sword arts was at least at the Immortal Emperor sword art level. They were definitely created by Immortal Emperor sword art. An Immortal Emperor sword art was considered a supreme sword art even among the inheritances of the Shang sword school. However, there were only 6 of them in the Shang sword school. But now, young Noble Zero Sword had casually unleashed 3 Immortal Emperor sword arts. Even in the 3 great sacred realms and celestial 9 domains, the Immortal Emperor's sword art was an absolute secret. Only those powerful sects with a long history could possess it. Since young Noble Zero Jian could control 3 Immortal Emperor sword arts, his background must be shocking. However, Chu Fengmian didn't care about the origin of this young Master Zero Jian. As long as he was an enemy of Chu Fengmian, he would kill him no matter what his origin was. Chu Fengmian unleashed countless sword arts to clash with young Noble Zero Sword. Every moment was enough for them to clash dozens of times. Young Noble Zero Sword also unleashed his sword arts to attack Chu Fengmian. However, he didn't use his full strength. He was able to deal with Chu Fengmian's sword arts with ease. The first Sword Emperor's sword art, the Supreme Sword School's sword art, and the Lord of Sword Dao's sword art. Such an opportunity has fallen into the hands of an ant from the lower realm. It's really a waste. Young Noble Zero Sword stared at Chu Fengmian with jealousy in his eyes. Chu Fengmian's Sword Dao inheritance made him extremely jealous. Whether it was the first Sword Emperor, the Lord of Sword Dao, or the Supreme Sword School, all of them were illustrious existences in the history of Sword Dao. Now, their inheritances were inherited by a little guy like Chu Fengmian. Since you don't want to hand it over, I'll suppress you and torture you bit by bit. Let's see how long you can endure. Suddenly, young Master Zero Sword's sword flashed and a sword light soared into the sky. It turned into a huge golden sword and descended from the sky. This huge golden sword contained a suppressive force. It was a suppressive technique. Young Noble Zero Sword finally lost his patience and directly attacked. He wanted to suppress Chu Fengmian once and for all. Hong Long Long. The power contained in the huge golden sword was completely different from the sword art that young Noble Zero Sword had used before. It was on a completely different level. The power was 10 times stronger. This kind of power was incomparably close to the level of the ancient White Wolf. Young Noble Zero Sword's true strength was actually close to the peak Immortal Monarch realm. As the huge golden sword descended, Chu Fengmian was under great pressure. Chu Fengmian did not expect young Noble Zero Sword to have reached such a level. As the huge golden sword pressed down, Chu Fengmian could feel the power of his bloodline boiling. Chu Fengmian's bloodline power was the bloodline of the 3 great innate divine beasts. Innate divine beasts were fearless even in the face of heaven and earth. The dignity that came from their bloodline would not allow anyone to suppress them. The bloodline of the 3 great innate divine beasts was pushed to the extreme in Chu Fengmian's body. Suddenly, the shadows of the 3 great innate divine beasts, Tianlong, Xianjing, and Heaven-Devouring Beast, soared into the sky from Chu Fengmian's back. The shadows of the 3 great innate divine beasts looked at the sky and the huge golden sword that was descending. They roared and resisted the huge golden sword with the power of their bloodline. World-suppressing sword. Young Noble Zero Sword was unperturbed when he saw this. He activated the sword edge again, and a surge of sword intent descended and infused into the huge golden sword. The huge golden sword was countless times larger than before. The power contained in it was also far stronger than before. It slowly pressed down. The shadows of the 3 great innate divine beasts behind Chu Fengmian were crazily squeezed and shrunk under the terrifying suppression. Hong. Even the space around Chu Fengmian began to solidify under the steady stream of suppressive power. The solidified space was tougher than a real immortal item. The solidified space around Chu Fengmian had turned into a huge cage. Chu Fengmian was trapped in the cage. Despite his continuous resistance, he was still suppressed bit by bit. In a few breaths' time, Chu Fengmian's body was compressed to the size of a few centimeters. In front of the huge golden sword, he was incomparably small. He could be completely suppressed by the huge golden sword at any time. It was almost a foregone conclusion that Chu Fengmian was suppressed. But at this moment, Chu Fengmian's body suddenly moved. Chapter 2361. All of a sudden, a shocking sword intent burst out from Chu Fengmian's body. The sword intent soared into the sky and collided with the giant golden sword. Chu Fengmian, who had been retreating under the suppression of the giant golden sword, suddenly launched a counterattack. Chu Fengmian's body recovered in an instant. Chu Fengmian, who had shrunk to a few centimeters under the suppression, suddenly returned to his normal appearance. A demonic aura was emitted from Chu Fengmian's body and shrouded him. Chu Fengmian's body began to grow. He became dozens of meters tall with a pair of wings on his back. His bronze-like skin was burning with red flames. Endless sword intent burst out from Chu Fengmian's body. At this moment, Chu Fengmian's aura was completely different from before. The chaotic tribulation thunder was finally completely devoured by Chu Fengmian's natal sword origin. Chu Fengmian used most of the power to suppress the chaotic tribulation thunder in his body, but at this moment all of it burst out. He broke out his strongest state. There was even a large amount of power rising from Chu Fengmian's body. Chu Fengmian's body began to sublimate. His realm was officially transforming into the celestial realm. The celestial being tribulation was the greatest threshold for all martial artists. Once one crossed the celestial tribulation and stepped into the celestial realm, the difference between celestial and man would be like ascending to immortality. In countless continents, there were rumors of ascending to immortality. This was the peak that most warriors looked forward to. Now, Chu Fengmian had finally reached this step. He had shed his mortal body and become an immortal. Chu Fengmian had been waiting for this moment for too long. In the star cave, Chu Fengmian finally stepped into the celestial realm. Suddenly, Chu Fengmian's body seemed to have turned into a huge vortex. The surrounding power of heaven and earth and spiritual qi of heaven and earth flew towards Chu Fengmian and were madly devoured. Chu Fengmian's power was growing and sublimating almost every moment. A large amount of power of heaven and earth poured into Chu Fengmian's body. Chu Fengmian's internal organs, his divine veins, his body, and the 129,600 immortal crystals all swallowed a large amount of power of heaven and earth. Their power grew rapidly. Young Master Lingjian, I don't care who you are or where you came from. Since you've provoked me today, only death awaits you. Chu Fengmian looked at young noble Zero Jian with boundless killing intent in his eyes. You also have many sword skills that I have never seen before. I won't kill you easily. I'll have the same idea as you. I'll suppress you and torture you until you tell me all your sword skills. You were actually hiding such power? The way young noble Zero Jian looked at Chu Fengmian changed. His usual indifferent attitude had changed. He was able to tell that Chu Fengmian's strength had definitely increased by tens or even hundreds of times. This sort of transformation was simply inhuman. Especially when he saw Chu Fengmian's appearance, it was as if he had seen a ghost. Sorcerer tribe? You're from the sorcerer tribe? How can there be a sorcerer tribe in a place like the lower realm? Moreover, a sorcerer tribe with the bloodline of the ancestral sorcerer tribe? Sorcerer tribe? Chu Fengmian suddenly frowned when he heard this name. However, before Chu Fengmian could continue speaking, young noble Zero Jian's face revealed a bit of ferocity. So what if you're from the sorcerer tribe? This is the Star Cave. No one can detect what's happening here. Those old guys won't know even if I kill you. A sorcerer tribe member has cultivated sword principle to such a level. You must have a bigger secret. Very well, I came to the lower realm this time to look for supreme sword qi. I didn't expect to encounter such a great opportunity. Supreme sword qi. Suppress. Suddenly, the power of young noble Zero Jian skyrocketed again. He controlled the giant golden sword and suppressed it again. You still want to suppress me? Ridiculous. Chu Fengmian's eyes revealed a bit of coldness. He poured his sword essence into the Taichu sword. The sword soared into the sky and collided with the giant golden sword in the air. In the instant of the collision, the enormous golden sword was directly shattered. Chu Fengmian's current strength was countless times stronger than when he was undergoing the Deva tribulation. After passing the Deva tribulation, Chu Fengmian didn't know what level his strength had reached. However, Chu Fengmian's current strength was definitely not inferior to young noble Zero Jian's. After the giant golden sword was shattered by Chu Fengmian's sword, Chu Fengmian instantly sent out several sword lights that slashed towards young noble Zero Jian from all directions. Young noble Zero Jian had been suppressing Chu Fengmian all this while, which made Chu Fengmian very angry. Now, it was time for young noble Zero Jian to have a taste of his own medicine. Boom! Chu Fengmian's sword lights flickered again and again, shattering the surrounding space under the sword lights. Chu Fengmian's current strength had finally reached the level where he could break through space. This place was extremely close to the three great saint domains. The space law was almost the complete space law of the three great saint domains. Only the strength of a peak immortal monarch was qualified to break through space. Now that Chu Fengmian's sword light could break through space, it meant that the sword light he sent out had the strength of a peak immortal monarch. Bam! Young noble Zero Jian did not expect the power contained in these sword lights. He originally wanted to casually use his sword to neutralize them, but he found that the power contained in these sword lights was not inferior to his full strength. Due to a moment of carelessness, one of the sword lights directly pierced young noble Zero Jian's back. Although it was stopped 3 inches away from young noble Zero Jian, young noble Zero Jian managed to block it. However, the power that erupted from the sword light still forced young noble Zero Jian to retreat dozens of miles away. His clothes were torn and tattered, making him look extremely miserable. Damn it! Young noble Zero Jian's face was filled with extreme anger, as if he was thoroughly enraged. His eyes were filled with blood-red killing intent. Suddenly, a sword light flew out from between his eyebrows. This golden light was only 3 inches long, and it turned into a golden spiritual sword. The moment the sword light flew out, Chu Fengmian felt the 2,815 strands of supreme sword qi in his body become restless. They even wanted to fly out and submit to the sword light. King Sword Qi. This sword light was the King Sword Qi of the Supreme Sword Qi. There were a total of 184 sword lights surrounding this King Sword Qi. They were the remaining 184 Supreme Sword Qi. Chapter 2362. 3,000 Supreme Sword Qi had appeared, but they were in the hands of young Masters Zero Jian and Chu Fengmian respectively. Chu Fengmian controlled 2,815 Supreme Sword Qi, while the remaining 185 Supreme Sword Qi and the most crucial King Sword Qi were in the hands of young Master Zero Jian. The King Sword Qi was the core of the 3,000 Supreme Sword Qi. The moment young Master Zero Jian activated the King Sword Qi, Chu Fengmian could feel the 2,815 Supreme Sword Qi in his body becoming restless, as if they were attracted by something and wanted to fly out of Chu Fengmian's body to young Master Zero Jian's side. Chu Fengmian's expression suddenly changed. The 3,000 Supreme Sword Qi was a whole entity. It could be said that only the 3,000 Supreme Sword Qi could display the true power of the Supreme Sword Qi. Not a single one of the 3,000 Supreme Sword Qis could be missing. Once the 3,000 Supreme Sword Qis were gathered, the power unleashed would be terrifying to the extreme. According to the records of the Sword Emperor Crown, once the 3,000 Sword Qi were gathered, it could easily kill an immortal saint. Once the formation was set up, it could even contend against an immortal venerable. Now, young Master Zero Jian activated the King Sword Qi to force all the Supreme Sword Qi out of Chu Fengmian's body for his own use. This was extremely dangerous for Chu Fengmian. If young Master Zero Jian obtained the 3,000 Supreme Sword Qi, it would be almost impossible for Chu Fengmian to escape unscathed. Suppress. In Chu Fengmian's body, the energy of the 129,600 immortal crystals was fully activated, suppressing the restless Supreme Sword Qi. Sword. But when Chu Fengmian was distracted to suppress the Supreme Sword Qi, young Master Zero Jian suddenly made his move. His sword flickered continuously, but no sword light could be seen clearly. The invisible sword suddenly slashed towards Chu Fengmian. The purpose of young Master Zero Jian's King Sword Qi was to distract Chu Fengmian from suppressing the Supreme Sword Qi. While Chu Fengmian was distracted, he took the opportunity to kill Chu Fengmian. The power of the invisible sword was countless times stronger than before. However, just as the formless sword approached Chu Fengmian, the tip of Chu Fengmian's sword suddenly moved. The tip of his sword flashed and collided with the sword chi. This sword chi was the invisible sword that young Master Zero Jian had unleashed. Previously, when Chu Fengmian faced the invisible sword, he could only rely on his innate reflex to dodge it. However, this time, Chu Fengmian was able to find the traces of the invisible sword in the void. Chu Fengmian Jian's heavenly immortal realm was a immortal ascension immortal realm. Once one stepped into the celestial being realm, one could be considered to have truly ascended to immortality. It was a completely different level from the half-step celestial being realm. In terms of mastery of laws, it was also on a completely different level. Fengmian Jian's immortal demon, immortal immortals. The moment he stepped into the celestial realm, Chu Fengmian felt that his control over the surrounding space was far better than before by dozens of times. Chu Fengmian had a panoramic view of the invisible sword that he couldn't see any flaw in. Bam! The moment the two swords collided, young Master Zero Jian's invisible sword was shattered in the air. The invisible sword young Master Zero Jian had unleashed was known for its strangeness. It was impossible to guard against it, but its real power was inferior to many immortal swordsmanship. Now that Chu Fengmian was in control of space, the so-called strangeness of the invisible sword didn't exist in front of Chu Fengmian. Naturally, the invisible sword was vulnerable. Is this all you have? Chu Fengmian's eyes showed some disdain. The mystery of the invisible sword was easily seen through by Chu Fengmian after he stepped into the heavenly immortal realm. This made Chu Fengmian a little disappointed. He thought that the invisible sword was more mysterious, but he didn't expect that it was just a space Dao swordsmanship. Such a swordsmanship was indeed terrifying when used against martial artists and demon immortals who were weaker than him. However, once the opponent's strength surpassed him, the invisible sword would be meaningless. It was only useful in a sneak attack. However, Chu Fengmian's sword Dao was a supreme great Dao. He wanted to use his sword Dao to crush everything in front of him. This kind of means was useless against him. However, the invisible sword was an immortal emperor-level swordsmanship. Once it could be integrated into the ancient swordsmanship book, it would be helpful to Chu Fengmian's sword Dao. Jiuyu. Young Master Zero Jian's face changed dramatically when he saw Chu Fengmian easily blocked the invisible sword. It was as if he had seen a ghost. Panic flashed in his eyes, which had always been arrogant and confident. It seemed that the situation in front of him had exceeded his expectations. He didn't expect that Chu Fengmian, who was just an ant in the lower world, could really threaten him. His swordsmanship was defeated by Chu Fengmian just like that. Young Master Zero Jian's swordsmanship was indeed at the level of an immortal emperor. However, Chu Fengmian's sword Dao had surpassed a true sword emperor. As for young Master Zero Jian, his sword Dao was nothing in front of Chu Fengmian. Before Chu Fengmian stepped into the celestial realm, young Master Zero Jian could still suppress him due to the gap in their cultivation levels. However, now that Chu Fengmian had stepped into the celestial realm, his strength was no longer inferior to young Master Zero Jian. In terms of sword Dao, Chu Fengmian had surpassed young Master Zero Jian. Young Master Zero Jian's strength was completely suppressed by Chu Fengmian. Sword! Chu Fengmian looked at young Master Zero Jian, and suddenly, his figure flickered. His speed was several times faster than before, and he arrived beside young Master Zero Jian in an instant. Suddenly, Chu Fengmian's sword slashed down. Boom! The power of the sword was far greater than before. As Chu Fengmian slashed out, he felt that the radiance of the primordial sword was even brighter than before. When Chu Fengmian was in the half-step celestial realm, it seemed a little difficult for him to wield the primordial sword. However, after stepping into the celestial realm, he could clearly feel the power of the primordial sword. The sword slashed down, shattering the space. Young Master Zero Jian was pushed into the depths of the void by the might of the sword. His body was constantly shaking. Young Master Zero Jian had already reacted when Chu Fengmian slashed out his sword. He held his spiritual sword in a panic and struck out the sword edge in an attempt to resist. However, the residual power still bombarded his body. Chapter 2363. The power of the swords collided again and again, making it hard for people to see what was happening. Only the explosions caused by the collision of the swords could be heard. Boom! Boom! Chu Fengmian and young Sir Zero Sword were using power and the Tao of the sword to fight each other head-on. The shockwave blasted Chu Fengmian's body. This power was enough to shatter a peak Immortal King realm martial artist and demon god into pieces. However, the moment the shockwaves hit Chu Fengmian, they were dispersed by the 129,600 immortal crystals in Chu Fengmian's body. Chu Fengmian transformed into the bronze celestial demon. His towering body, which was dozens of meters tall, stood there without moving at all. He held the Taichu sword in his hand and slashed down in a frenzy. Compared to Chu Fengmian, young Master Zero Jian's side was in a more difficult situation. The shockwaves from the collisions slammed into young Noble Zero Jian's body, causing him to be swallowed whole. 8 Su. For a moment, young Master Zero Jian was forced to step back, screaming from time to time. He didn't have a heaven-defying body like Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian's immortal true body had reached the 5th level. The strength of his body had reached an unimaginable level. The shockwaves couldn't hurt Chu Fengmian at all. He was even more unscrupulous when he displayed his swordsmanship, not worrying about the backlash of the shockwaves. The situation was reversed in an instant. In addition, after Chu Fengmian's immortal true body reached the 5th level, his meridians had merged with his divine meridians, which strengthened his divine meridians by 100 times. His current strength was extremely strong. When he displayed his sword skills, his immortal energy was like free money, crazily bombarding down. Every move was a full-powered attack. Not even an immortal saint could do such a crazy attack. But Chu Fengmian did it. The continuous bombardment made it harder for young Master Zero Jian to deal with. Time and time again, the shock waves of the attacks struck young Master Zero Jian's body. Although the shock waves couldn't harm him at all, young Master Zero Jian's body was still extremely weak. But when hundreds or thousands of shock waves were added together, it was completely different. Young Noble Zero Jian's face turned pale, and he suddenly vomited a mouthful of blood. Thousands of swords collided with each other, and all the aftershocks bombarded his body. Young Master Zero Sword was unable to suppress the power of the aftershock. Suddenly, he coughed out a mouthful of blood. Just as young Master Zero Jian was about to give up, Chu Fengmian suddenly made his move. With a thought, he condensed his immortal force and transformed it into an invisible giant hand that slammed down on young Master Zero Jian. Ancient Emperor seizing the art of war. Rumble. This invisible hand directly enveloped young Master Zero Jian's body, and suddenly, it grabbed the king's sword chi inside his body, and grabbed it with a loud bang. Of the countless treasures on Prince Zero Jian's body, Chu Fengmian was most interested in the king's sword chi. As long as he obtained this king's sword chi, Chu Fengmian would be able to completely control the supreme sword chi. Therefore, Chu Fengmian seized the opportunity and immediately activated the ancient emperor's art of war to directly take the king's sword chi. Ancient Emperor's art of war? Seeing this invisible giant hand, young Master Zero Sword's face suddenly changed, and his eyes revealed a trace of madness. Want to take away the king's sword chi? Dream on. While speaking, young Master Zero Sword suddenly took out a jade talisman and suddenly crushed it. The moment the jade talisman was taken out, Chu Fengmian's eyes suddenly changed. He could feel a kind of extreme horror from the jade talisman. This kind of power was the most terrifying power Chu Fengmian had ever seen. The moment young Master Zero's sword took out the jade talisman, Chu Fengmian wanted to stop him. However, young Master Zero's sword's speed was too fast, and Chu Fengmian did not have the time to stop him. He could only watch helplessly as the jade talisman was crushed. The power contained within the jade talisman suddenly began to condense behind young Master Zero's sword. It gradually transformed into a human figure behind Chu Fengmian. As the human figure condensed, a kind of majestic aura descended. Under this imposing aura, it was as if all the martial artists and demon gods would have to submit. The human figure was incomparably illusory, and no one could see the appearance of the figure behind it. However, His Majesty had already descended, and no one could challenge this majesty. Immortal Emperor. This is the incarnation of an immortal emperor. That jade talisman is actually an incarnation personally refined by an immortal emperor. Under the pressure, Chu Fengmian also knew the identity of the figure. It was an immortal emperor. Only an immortal emperor could have such power. Once he descended, all the immortals would submit. Even if it was just an incarnation, the power it contained was still extremely terrifying. Chu Fengmian never imagined that young Master Zero's sword would have a jade talisman that could condense an immortal emperor's incarnation. An immortal emperor's incarnation? An incarnation jade talisman refined by an immortal emperor? How is this possible? What is the origin of this person? Could he be the son of an immortal emperor? Not only Chu Fengmian, but even Elder Fan in Chu Fengmian's mind said in shock. One should know that such an incarnation wasn't something that could be casually refined. Any incarnation that was refined into a jade talisman would have to consume a little bit of their own origin energy. For an immortal emperor, even if it was just a trace of their origin energy, it would take at least thousands of years or even tens of thousands of years to recover. Moreover, it might affect their advancement to a higher realm. Therefore, the higher the realm of an expert, the more reluctant they were to refine an incarnation jade talisman. In Sword Emperor Guan's memory, even in the Shang Sword sect, the protection for the core disciples was only the incarnation jade talisman refined by immortal venerables. As for the incarnation jade talisman of the immortal emperor level, even the disciples of immortal emperors might not be qualified to obtain it. Only those peerless geniuses that were rarely seen in thousands of years were qualified to make an immortal emperor consume a trace of their origin energy to refine an incarnation jade talisman. An immortal emperor-level incarnation jade talisman might not appear in the world, even in the three saint domains, for hundreds of thousands of years. Chu Fengmian had already estimated the identity of young Master Zero's sword. But with the appearance of this immortal emperor incarnation jade talisman, Chu Fengmian's guess about young Master Zero's sword's identity was completely shattered. This person's background was absolutely terrifying to the extreme. At least, there was an immortal emperor behind him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to obtain such an immortal emperor incarnation jade talisman. Chapter 2364. I've actually provoked such a troublesome character. Chu Fengmian felt that the situation was extremely troublesome. The origin of this young Master Ling Jian was far beyond his expectations. To be able to obtain an immortal emperor incarnation jade talisman, obviously, there was an immortal emperor who valued young Master Ling Jian greatly. But today, Chu Fengmian had thoroughly offended young Master Ling Jian. As long as Chu Fengmian was unwilling to give up the supreme sword qi in his hand, young Master Ling Jian would definitely not let him go. Chu Fengmian and young Master Ling Jian would definitely have a battle. After all, there was only one master for supreme sword qi. Letting young Master Ling Jian go today was the same as letting a tiger return to the mountain. Thinking of this, Chu Fengmian did not have the slightest hesitation. Even in the face of an immortal emperor's incarnation, Chu Fengmian did not shrink back. he suddenly activated the power of the ancient emperor's art of war. The invisible hand shrouded young Master Ling Jian's body. Suddenly, the king's sword qi in between his eyebrows was forcibly extracted. "Master, save me!" Young Master Ling Jian saw this scene and shouted loudly to the immortal emperor's incarnation. This king's sword qi was a necessary item for him to collect the 3,000 supreme sword qi. If he lost this king's sword qi, there was no way he could contend against Chu Fengmian. Supreme Sword Qi was related to the great secret of the Supreme Sword Sect. He was unwilling to let Chu Fengmian obtain this King's Sword Qi. In order to protect this King's Sword Qi, young Master Ling Jian did not hesitate to activate the Immortal Emperor Incarnation Jade Talisman. Each Immortal Emperor Incarnation Jade Talisman was a priceless treasure. It was equivalent to an Immortal Emperor personally taking action. If taken out, it could be exchanged for dozens of immortal tools. Even young Master Ling Jian could only obtain one Immortal Emperor Incarnation Jade Talisman. It was impossible for him to obtain a second chance. This Immortal Emperor Incarnation Jade Talisman was only used in a life and death crisis. If Chu Fengmian was not about to seize the King's Sword Qi, he would not have used it. "You actually crushed the Jade Talisman? Who is it? Who can force you to this point?" Along with young Master Ling Jian's voice, the figure slowly condensed. The figure's true body seemed to be in a distant space. However, as soon as he opened his mouth, an unparalleled might enveloped the area. Chu Fengmian could feel that his power was being suppressed. Ordinary immortal kings, or even immortal monarchs, would be completely suppressed in front of an immortal emperor, even if it was just an immortal emperor's incarnation. This kind of suppression that came from power was simply impossible to resist. However, Chu Fengmian resisted the suppression of the immortal emperor's aura. His bloodline power was pushed to the extreme. Chu Fengmian wasn't afraid of the immortal emperor's aura. Chu Fengmian was a heaven-defying variant. Even the heavenly Tao wasn't enough to scare him, let alone an immortal emperor. Strip. Chu Fengmian resisted the pressure and once again used the ancient emperor's art of war to grab young noble Zero Jian's body. More than half of the king's sword qi in young noble Zero Jian's forehead had been taken out by the ancient emperor's art of war. Seeing that Chu Fengmian could still make a move, young noble Zero Jian's eyes looked as if he had seen a ghost. Even he would be suffocated by the immortal emperor's aura, but Chu Fengmian didn't seem to be affected at all. For a moment, young noble Zero Jian forgot to resist. By the time he reacted, the king's sword qi had already flown out of young noble Zero Jian's body. This king's sword qi seemed to have followed young noble Zero's sword for a very long time, and contained his imprint. Even when the ancient emperor seized the art of war, the king's sword qi still resisted the power of the ancient emperor's art of war. This kind of imprint was almost impossible to erase. However, the ancient emperor's art of war was also an invincible secret technique in the ancient era. As long as it was targeted by the ancient emperor's art of war, even if it was an extreme immortal weapon or an immortal emperor's imprint, it wouldn't be able to resist. Chu Fengmian circulated the ancient emperor's art of war. Immediately, a wave of energy turned into a heaven-devouring divine light that drilled into the king's sword qi and began to devour the imprint left behind by young noble Zero Jian. Interesting. A little guy can actually ignore this emperor's aura? At this time, the immortal emperor's clone slowly woke up. He opened his eyes and looked at Chu Fengmian. His tone was filled with curiosity as he carefully sized up Chu Fengmian. A heaven and earth variant? In an instant, the immortal emperor's clone spoke. His tone was filled with extreme surprise. Even with his identity as an immortal emperor, he was shocked to the extreme when he saw Chu Fengmian. A heaven and earth variant? A person who has crossed a heaven-defying tribulation? Young noble Zero Jian was also stunned upon hearing this. Chu Fengmian was a heaven and earth variant who had crossed a heaven-defying tribulation and fused with primordial qi. For most martial artists and demon gods, even if they saw it with their own eyes, they wouldn't be able to tell. Even with young noble Zero Jian's experience, he couldn't tell. However, the immortal emperor's clone saw through Chu Fengmian's deepest secret with a single glance. A heaven and earth variant who defied the heavens. The moment he looked at Chu Fengmian, there were no more secrets on Chu Fengmian. Nothing could escape the eyes of the immortal emperor's incarnation. Chu Fengmian was also aware of all this. Even though he had tried his best to conceal it, he couldn't hide it from the eyes of the immortal emperor's clone. The experience of an immortal emperor was beyond Chu Fengmian's imagination. He actually fused with the origin energy of the three great innate divine beasts. How could there be such a person? How could there be such a heaven-defying existence in the lower realm? The more he saw through Chu Fengmian's opportunity, the more shocked the immortal emperor's clone was. Even with his experience, he was completely stunned. Even in the three great saint domains, there was no existence like Chu Fengmian. Since ancient times, there weren't many geniuses who could compare to Chu Fengmian. Interesting. I didn't expect to meet such a person. Very good. A heaven and earth variant who has fused with the origin energy of the three great innate divine beasts. He has also condensed the shaman true body and reached the 5th level. It's simply a perfect body. The immortal emperor's clone's voice was filled with endless greed. A perfect body. Once I possess this body, it's not impossible for me to cross the heavenly tribulation and step into the sovereign realm in the future. This is an opportunity delivered to my doorstep. Zero Jian, you've given me a great gift this time. Chapter 2365. The immortal emperor's clone looked at Chu Fengmian as if he was looking at a treasure within reach. Some weaker cultivators might not be able to see the value of Chu Fengmian's various opportunities, but the immortal emperor was well aware of what Chu Fengmian's various opportunities would bring him in the future. For example, the primordial force, a worldly variant, couldn't display its true might when one's cultivation level was low. But once one stepped into the immortal venerate realm, or even the immortal emperor realm, this terrifying aspect would be perfectly displayed. The 12 innate divine beasts of the primordial era each possessed the strength to contend against a peak immortal emperor and stand shoulder to shoulder with a ruler. They relied on the primordial force. Not even an immortal emperor could control this power. A cultivator who'd transcended a heaven-defying tribulation was, in his opinion, the perfect flesh. Once he possessed Chu Fengmian's body, all these opportunities would belong to him. Even the immortal emperor was laughing heartily. Good, good, the perfect body will soon belong to me. If you want to possess my body, you'll have to be qualified first. While the immortal emperor's clone was laughing, Chu Fengmian suddenly made his move. The primordial sword in his hand was suddenly infused with sword intent, and he suddenly struck out. The target of this strike wasn't the immortal emperor's clone. 9 Profound. The power of the stars condensed on the blade. The moment Chu Fengmian struck out, the power of the stars descended like a river of sword qi and enveloped the immortal emperor's clone. An incarnation of an immortal emperor, even if it was just a small incarnation, still contained the power of an immortal emperor and was extremely powerful. Chu Fengmian also knew that there was no way he could contend against the immortal emperor's clone. The moment the immortal emperor's clone attacked, Chu Fengmian would have no chance of victory. Therefore, Chu Fengmian took the initiative to attack. His sword had been accumulating power all this time. At this moment, the power accumulated to the peak, and suddenly, the sword poured out in torrents. The immortal emperor's clone didn't seem to have expected Chu Fengmian to take the initiative to attack. It was as if an ant was provoking a giant beast. This was beyond common sense. The immortal emperor's clone was caught off guard. However, He was, after all, an immortal emperor with countless battle experience. He was extremely calm. All of a sudden, the immortal emperor's clone waved his hand and easily blocked the sword Chi galaxy. The sword Chi galaxy was less than 3 inches away from the celestial emperor avatar, but it couldn't advance any further. Not bad. That should be the Jiuxuan immortal art. Seems like you have obtained it. You actually transformed it into a sword technique. Compared to the Jiuxuan immortal art, this is almost the same. You have such talent. The immortal emperor's clone blocked the sword Chi Star River. He was still carefully sizing it up. His eyes were filled with greed. The more powerful Chu Fengmian was, the more benefits he would get once he occupied Chu Fengmian's body. His strength had been stuck at this level for hundreds of thousands of years. It could be said that without a heaven-defying opportunity, his strength would not be able to improve in the future. If he wanted to improve his strength, he could only choose to seize another body to obtain a better aptitude. Although he would lose a part of his strength in a short period of time, he would be able to recover the strength of an immortal emperor with his experience. Many immortal emperors had reached the last step and couldn't go any further, so they chose to seize another body to cultivate again. In the eyes of this immortal emperor, Chu Fengmian was the best body, a perfect piece of jade. Kid, there's no need to struggle in front of yours truly. Hand over your body obediently. It's your honor to be able to become yours truly's body. The immortal emperor's clone said ferociously. Although the appearance of the immortal emperor's clone couldn't be seen clearly, the ferocious meaning in his words could still be heard. Chu Fengmian snorted coldly and didn't answer. Instead, he attacked the immortal emperor's clone with his sword again. All resistance will be meaningless. The immortal emperor's clone roared and waved his hand. Chu Fengmian's countless sword techniques were ruthlessly crushed. At the same time, a huge arm suddenly condensed out of thin air and suddenly pressed down, grabbing at Chu Fengmian. The power of the huge arm was like the power of a world. It pressed down fiercely. It was unknown how much space was crushed. In the shattered space, Chu Fengmian's body flickered repeatedly, avoiding the grasp of the huge arm. Suddenly, Chu Fengmian's body moved. His speed was extremely fast as he suddenly swept across. This time, Chu Fengmian's target was no longer the immortal emperor's clone, but young Master Zero Jian. Impudent! Chu Fengmian had just arrived in front of young Master Zero Jian. Behind Chu Fengmian, the immortal emperor's clone roared angrily. Chu Fengmian was planning to kill young Master Zero Jian in front of him. It was simply disregarding the dignity of an immortal emperor. The dignity of an immortal emperor was not to be challenged. All of a sudden, the speed of the enormous arm increased by countless times. At this moment, it came crashing down. Boom! Chu Fengmian's body was smashed to pieces by the giant arm. But at the same time as the explosion, suddenly, a figure emerged behind young Master Zero Jian. This figure was Chu Fengmian. Unknowingly, Chu Fengmian suddenly appeared behind young Master Zero Jian. The one who had been killed by the giant arm was only an illusion. Sure enough, even the power of an immortal emperor will be affected in this star cave. Chu Fengmian suddenly appeared behind young Master Zero Jian with a smile on his face. Chu Fengmian had taken the initiative to attack the immortal emperor's clone just now to probe. An immortal emperor's clone, even if it only had 1/10,000th of an immortal emperor's power, was indeed not something that Chu Fengmian could contend against. Whether it was in the 9 heavens domains or the extraterritorial starry sky, the result would not change. Only in this place, in this star cave, there was a glimmer of hope for Chu Fengmian. The star cave was a unique region formed by the collision of 2 universes. The laws here were extremely chaotic. Although it was close to the 3 saint domains, there were still some differences. Moreover, there were some changes that could occur at any time. In fact, the power of the experts who descended here was transmitted from a distant place. Chapter 2366. Even an immortal emperor wouldn't know how to transmit his power from hundreds of millions of miles away. It would be fine if it was in a place where space was stable. However, this was the Star Cave, one of the most complicated places in space law. The power transmitted by the immortal emperor was far less than 1/10,000th of it. Therefore, the incarnation was far from being as terrifying as a real immortal emperor's incarnation. A real immortal emperor's incarnation was at least comparable to an immortal venerable. However, the power of the incarnation was only at the pinnacle of immortal monarch realm. It was only slightly stronger than young Master Zero Jian. Although it was extremely powerful, it wasn't impossible for Chu Fengmian to contend against it. Moreover, the strongest point of an immortal sovereign's incarnation wasn't their strength, but the pressure that came from the level of their strength. When an immortal sovereign's incarnation descended, even some immortal saints would feel fear in their hearts. They wouldn't dare to fight as half of their strength would be suppressed. However, the immortal emperor's pressure was meaningless in front of Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian was a heaven and earth variant. It could be said that he was comparable to an innate divine beast. An innate divine beast was comparable to a pinnacle immortal emperor or even a supreme ruler. When the immortal emperor's pressure descended, it came from the power of Chu Fengmian's bloodline. Thus, Chu Fengmian wasn't affected at all. After realizing all this, Chu Fengmian immediately changed his mind to escape. This young Master Zero Jian had a profound background. Moreover, his talent was incomparably heaven-defying. He wasn't much older than Chu Fengmian. One must know that Chu Fengmian's current strength was due to the accumulation of Sword Dao in his previous life. In terms of talent, young Master Zero Jian might be superior to Chu Fengmian. If he let young Master Zero Jian go today, it would be tantamount to releasing a tiger back to the mountain. If young Master Zero Jian was allowed to grow, the consequences would be unimaginable. When Chu Fengmian discovered that the immortal emperor's incarnation wasn't completely undefeatable, he made up his mind to kill young Master Zero Jian today. Young Master Zero Jian was taken aback by Chu Fengmian's sudden appearance. After Chu Fengmian stepped into the celestial realm, the bloodline power of the three innate divine beasts in his body had also improved by leaps and bounds. In particular, Chu Fengmian's control over the space Dao was dozens of times better than before. He suddenly turned into a shadow and quietly appeared behind young Noble Zero Jian. Not only young Noble Zero Jian, but even the immortal emperor's incarnation was unable to see through him. "You!" Seeing Chu Fengmian behind him, young Master Zero Jian's face changed. He hastily urged his sword to resist. However, Chu Fengmian's sword was even faster than his. The primordial sword in his hand moved and a sword light slashed out, colliding with Zero's sword. There was a loud boom. Prince Zero's sword vibrated continuously, and the sword intent contained within it was completely shattered by the collision. Pooh! Young Master Zero's sword spat out a mouthful of blood essence. He was unable to withstand the power of the shockwave. He was already injured in the previous exchange. This time, he was even more injured. Die! After the first strike, Chu Fengmian did not hesitate at all and slashed down again. Kill him while he's down. It was not easy for Chu Fengmian to force young Noble Zero Jian into a desperate situation. Today, he must kill him no matter what. The sword in his hand flickered again and again, and the sword intent contained within it transformed into countless shadows of dragons and giant whales. In Chu Fengmian's bloodline, the bloodlines of the two great innate divine beasts, Tianlong and Xianjing, boiled instantly and transformed into a giant sword that was hundreds of thousands of feet long. It slashed down at young Noble Zero Jian. The sword seemed to be able to split open heaven and earth. It was as if the firmament had made its move to destroy the world. Young Noble Zero Jian was almost powerless in front of the giant sword. The spiritual sword in his hand was knocked away, and was caught by Chu Fengmian. Young noble Zero Jian's spiritual sword was no ordinary weapon. It was one of the top immortal weapons among countless immortal weapons. It was only one step away from becoming an extreme immortal weapon and was enough to contend with the primordial sword. Such a spiritual sword was priceless even in the three great holy realms. An extreme immortal weapon was an unattainable existence for immortal venerables. In Sword Emperor Crown's memory, there were many immortal emperors who were not qualified to wield an extreme immortal weapon. Those who could wield an extreme immortal weapon were, without exception, the strongest among the immortal emperors. A peak immortal weapon could be considered as a weapon of many immortal emperors. The spiritual sword in young noble Zero Jian's hand belonged to this level. It was enough to be used as a weapon by some powerful immortal venerables or even weak immortal emperors. Young noble Zero Jian was obviously favored by the immortal emperor behind him. That was why he was given such a spiritual sword. But now it belonged to Chu Fengmian. At the same time, young noble Zero Jian's strength had reached its weakest moment. Chu Fengmian abruptly activated the ancient emperor's art of war and suddenly descended. This time, the invisible hand was not obstructed at all as it descended. Young noble Zero Jian was already powerless to protect himself. How could he still care about the ancient emperor's art of war? The king's sword qi hidden in young noble Zero Jian's body suddenly flew out and was caught by the ancient emperor's art of war. The mark that belonged to young noble Zero Jian was cruelly erased by Chu Fengmian's heaven-devouring power. Puff! Young noble Zero Jian spurted out another mouthful of blood. The mark on the king's sword qi contained his heart's blood. But now it was directly erased by Chu Fengmian. The backlash was unbearable for him. After seizing the king's sword qi, Chu Fengmian continued to activate the ancient emperor's art of war to seize the other supreme sword qi from young noble Zero Jian's body. Chu Fengmian controlled 2,815 supreme sword qi. The remaining 185 supreme sword qi were all in young noble Zero Jian's hands. Right now, the most crucial king sword qi was already under Chu Fengmian's control. The remaining 184 supreme sword qi were still hidden in young noble Zero Jian's body. After seizing the remaining 184 supreme sword qi, Chu Fengmian would be able to control the 3,000 supreme sword qi and unleash the true power of the supreme sword formation. Chu Fengmian used the ancient emperor's art of war to transform into an invisible giant hand that enveloped young noble Zero Jian's body. Rays of golden light flew out from young noble Zero Jian's body. They were the supreme sword qi that had been seized by the ancient emperor's art of war. Chapter 2367. Young Master Zero Jian was seriously injured. His face was extremely pale, and it was extremely strenuous for him to resist the giant sword that was hundreds of thousands of feet long. He simply could not spare any effort to resist the power of the ancient emperor's art of war. Now, young Master Zero Jian had no strength to fight back and was completely at Chu Fengmian's mercy. Chu Fengmian did not hold back. It wasn't just young Master Zero Jian's supreme sword energy. Chu Fengmian used the ancient emperor's art of war to seize his immortal artifacts and void ring. Young Master Zero Jian's status was extremely noble. He was someone favored by an immortal emperor. None of his immortal tools were ordinary grade. Almost all of them were high-grade immortal tools. They were much better than the immortal tools Chu Fengmian obtained in the 9 domains. These immortal tools were directly seized by Chu Fengmian using the ancient emperor's art of war and fell into his hands. Chu Fengmian did not have the time to refine these fairy artifacts. He directly suppressed them with his dragon's might, then threw them all into the empty ring. He would come back to inspect these immortal tools one by one when he had time in the future. All of this happened in an instant. Young Master Zero Jian had become a general without an army under Chu Fengmian's art of war. Even the spiritual sword in his hand had fallen into Chu Fengmian's hands. Only some supreme sword qi was firmly suppressed in his body to resist the ancient emperor's art of war. Young Master Zero Jian also knew that if these 3,000 supreme sword qi were obtained by one person, it would definitely cause a great change. Therefore, he would rather give up his immortal tools than give up the supreme sword qi. Chu Fengmian had seized a total of 174 supreme sword qi from young Master Zero Jian's body. Including the king's sword qi that Chu Fengmian had seized, Chu Fengmian had a total of 2,990 supreme sword qi. There were only 10 supreme sword qi left. Once he obtained them, he would be able to restore the full power of the supreme sword qi. However, the last 10 supreme sword qi were suppressed in the deepest part of young Master Zero's body, suppressed in his spiritual vein. No matter how hard Chu Fengmian tried to use the ancient emperor's art of seizing war, he couldn't take the last 10 supreme sword qi from young noble Zero's body. Chu Fengmian's eyes were filled with anxiety. He was not willing to continue this stalemate with young noble Zero's sword. Even though Chu Fengmian had obtained 2,990 strands of supreme sword qi, he was still unable to unleash its true power. In fact, he could not even unleash half of its true power. The 3,000 supreme sword qis were a whole, and not a single one could be missing. But now, young noble Zero's sword had hidden the remaining 10 supreme sword qi in his spiritual vein. Unless Chu Fengmian killed young noble Zero's sword, there was no way he could obtain the remaining 10 supreme sword qi. Heavenly punishment! During this stalemate, a huge sword shadow suddenly appeared in the sky and slashed toward Chu Fengmian. After being tricked by Chu Fengmian, the immortal Emperor Avatar finally reacted. However, the immortal Emperor Avatar was very blurry and his face couldn't be seen clearly. But from this roar, one could clearly feel the anger of the immortal Emperor Avatar. He, a majestic immortal emperor, was actually tricked by Chu Fengmian. What he attacked with his full strength was actually just a shadow formed by Chu Fengmian. He was an immortal emperor, an emperor among immortals. His prestige was not to be challenged. Suddenly, a crack appeared above Chu Fengmian's head. A crack appeared in the star hole. Rays of golden light were emitted from the crack, dazzling everyone's eyes. The immortal emperor's incarnation had already disappeared. At this moment, Chu Fengmian suddenly noticed that the immortal Emperor Avatar had already disappeared. The huge sword shadow had actually appeared from the crack. The main body has descended. He actually tore a star hole? Does he want to die? Chu Fengmian's face changed drastically when he saw the crack. He never thought that he would summon the main body of an immortal emperor to come and kill Chu Fengmian. One should know that this was the star hole, the place where two universes collided. The laws here were incomparably strange, and it could be called a dangerous place. There were many dangers in the star hole that were incomparably troublesome for immortal emperors. Even immortal emperors wouldn't easily step into the star hole. But this immortal emperor actually tore the space of the star hole and wanted to descend into the star hole with his main body, directly breaking the laws of the star hole. This was an extremely crazy act. This immortal emperor was completely enraged by Chu Fengmian. He was so angry that his mind was muddled. He had already disregarded everything and wanted to descend into the star hole with his main body to kill Chu Fengmian. The prestige of an immortal emperor couldn't be challenged. Even immortal saints and immortal venerables couldn't challenge the prestige of an immortal emperor, let alone Chu Fengmian, who was just a brat who had just stepped into the celestial realm. In his opinion, an ant-like existence had actually toyed with him. In his anger, this immortal emperor disregarded all dangers and descended into the star hole to kill Chu Fengmian. Although the golden light in the crack was only an arm of the immortal emperor's main body, the sword shadow it shot out was completely different from the incarnation. Chu Fengmian's hair stood on end in an instant. An immortal emperor suddenly attacked him. Chu Fengmian's current situation was extremely dangerous. When this huge sword shadow descended, all of Chu Fengmian's power couldn't withstand a single blow. The huge sword that was originally suppressing young Master Zero Jian instantly collapsed in front of this sword shadow. Tianlong change. At this time, there was only one thought in Chu Fengmian's mind, and that was to escape quickly. Facing the main body of an immortal emperor, Chu Fengmian's strength was far from being able to contend against it even if he was 100 times stronger. Killing young Master Zero Jian to prevent future troubles and the remaining 10 supreme sword chis were simply not something he should think about. Once that huge sword shadow descended, Chu Fengmian would undoubtedly die even if he had 10,000 lives. Even the terrifying recovery ability of the immortal true body would be useless. The power contained in that huge sword shadow wasn't something Chu Fengmian could contend against. No matter how strong his recovery ability was, he would be annihilated by the power contained in that huge sword shadow. His figure transformed into progenitor Tianlong and suddenly flew into the depths of the star hole. At the same time, the huge sword shadow was chasing after Chu Fengmian. Wherever the huge sword shadow passed, space would collapse. Chu Fengmian felt as if the power of the huge sword shadow was going to tear the star cave apart. Chapter 2368. As the giant sword shadow descended, it was blocked by the layers of spatial laws of the star cave. The attack of this immortal emperor had crossed hundreds of millions of miles and broken through countless layers of space to forcefully enter the star cave. It was as if he wanted to tear a hole in the star cave. If it wasn't for the resistance of the star cave's laws, the giant sword shadow would have beheaded Chu Fengmian on the spot. Even the laws of the star cave couldn't withstand the full attack of such an immortal emperor. The star cave's layers of space were broken and a huge crack was torn open. The attack of a true immortal emperor had the power to destroy the world. If this giant sword shadow fell into the extraterritorial starry sky, it could probably destroy dozens of planets in an instant. It should be known that the spatial laws of the star cave were much stronger than the spatial laws of the extraterritorial starry sky. Yet, it couldn't withstand the giant sword shadow. Fortunately, the star cave's laws were resisting now, so Chu Fengmian could still buy some time to catch his breath. Chu Fengmian fled all the way to the depths of the star cave. The giant sword shadow was right behind Chu Fengmian, chasing after him relentlessly. Everything in the path of the giant sword shadow was destroyed. It seemed as if there was nothing in the world that could stop the giant sword shadow. Damn it, how can it be so powerful? Chu Fengmian urged the power of primogenitor Tianlong to the extreme. His speed of escape light could cross thousands of miles in an instant, but he still couldn't escape the shroud of the giant sword shadow. The giant sword shadow had been shrouding Chu Fengmian's head and was still approaching. This giant sword shadow was an attack of the immortal emperor that crossed hundreds of millions of miles. Although it was the attack of his true body, who knew how many layers of space it had crossed? Its power was less than 10%, but it was still an existence that Chu Fengmian couldn't resist. Even the current star cave couldn't stop the giant sword shadow. Rumble! The space in the star cave began to collapse. The bombardment of the giant sword shadow caused the star cave around Chu Fengmian to change. Countless spatial cracks appeared, and even a storm began to appear. Star cave storm. Chu Fengmian's expression changed drastically when he saw the storm. The star cave storm wasn't comparable to the spatial storms outside. Once a living being was drawn into the star cave storm, it might be directly drawn into the core of the star cave, where the forces of the two universes collided. The so-called star hole was, in fact, a safe place between the collision of two universes. It was even a place of collision. However, it was in other places. Once one was drawn into the storm of the star cave, one might be drawn into those places. Even immortal sages and immortal venerables might die on the spot. Even immortal emperors couldn't contend with the forces of the two universes. Chu Fengmian didn't expect that the sudden attack of an immortal emperor would cause a star cave storm. This storm engulfed everything. Instantly, Chu Fengmian felt a huge pulling force that wanted to pull him in. Of time. At this critical moment, Chu Fengmian's mind spun rapidly. Suddenly, Chu Fengmian made a decision. His figure moved abruptly and flew directly in the direction of the star hole storm. Sooner or later, Chu Fengmian would be caught up by the huge sword shadow. At that time, Chu Fengmian would die. Although it was extremely dangerous to enter the star cave storm, there was a slim chance of survival. It was up to him to decide where he would be drawn into the star cave storm. There were also some demon immortals who had entered the star cave storm and returned safely. Although the probability was less than 1 in 10,000, there was no other choice. Entering the star cave storm was Chu Fengmian's only choice. Otherwise, Chu Fengmian would die under the sword of this immortal emperor. At that time, Chu Fengmian would definitely die. Chu Fengmian's conveyance light rapidly flew into the star cave storm. At the same time, he injected all his strength into his immortal real body, protecting it with all his strength. Hong. Chu Fengmian's body was drawn into the star cave storm. In an instant, he felt his body was about to be torn apart. The power of the star cave storm alone was enough to tear Chu Fengmian apart. However, Chu Fengmian guarded his immortal real body with all his might. At the same time, he urged the power of the divine tree to reinforce the 129,600 immortal crystals. One by one, the immortal crystals were reconstructed and restored. After an unknown amount of time, Chu Fengmian's consciousness began to blur. His immortal crystals had been shattered thousands of times. After being reconstructed again and again, Chu Fengmian's last bit of strength was exhausted. Now, all Chu Fengmian could do was to use his last bit of strength to protect his body. After a long time, just as Chu Fengmian's consciousness was about to fall unconscious, he finally saw a ray of light. Chu Fengmian used his last bit of strength to urge the conveyance light into the ray of light. Finally, he lost consciousness and fainted. Within the star cave storm, Chu Fengmian had to endure the force of the storm at every moment. Chu Fengmian didn't know how much time had passed. He drifted along with the star cave storm and didn't know where he ended up. If I can survive, I must kill that young master Ling Jian and that immortal emperor. I must kill them. Chu Fengmian's mind was filled with this thought before he lost consciousness. He was in such a miserable state because of these two people. As he thought about it, Chu Fengmian lost consciousness. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious for. Chu Fengmian slowly regained consciousness. As soon as he opened his eyes, he found himself in a huge house. This house was almost 100 times bigger than the houses in the 9 regions. It was 200 to 300 meters tall. At the same time, the bed Chu Fengmian was lying on was 200 to 300 meters long and wide. It was as big as a plaza. It wasn't just the bed. Everything in the house, from chairs to tables, were 100 times bigger than the ones in the 9 regions. For a moment, Chu Fengmian suspected that he had shrunk. But when he looked carefully, he found that it wasn't that he had shrunk, but that these things were just that big. The legs of the table were directly cut down from a tree that was hundreds of meters tall and installed. What exactly is this place? Chu Fengmian's mind was in a mess. He wanted to get up, but he found that his body was incomparably weak. He could barely move. Chapter 2369. Chu Fengmian carefully examined his body. Now, he could only describe it as a tragic sight. Most of the 129,600 immortal crystals were completely shattered and had lost their power. The remaining ones were also extremely broken. It could be said that almost none of the 129,600 immortal crystals were still intact. However, this was normal. In the star-hole storm, Chu Fengmian's body was torn apart again and again. All of Chu Fengmian's power was used to reconstruct the immortal crystals. In the end, Chu Fengmian's power was completely exhausted. He could only restore and reconstruct some. There were a few times when the 129,600 immortal crystals in Chu Fengmian's body were almost completely shattered and Chu Fengmian almost died. Now, Chu Fengmian's body could actually be said to be the 129,600 immortal crystals. Once all 129,600 immortal crystals were shattered, Chu Fengmian would die on the spot. Fortunately, in the end, when Chu Fengmian was almost unable to hold on any longer, he discovered the light and rushed in with all his strength. It seemed that the light should be outside the star hole. Even now, Chu Fengmian didn't know where exactly he was. The house in front of him was strangely huge. Although there were some palaces in the 9 regions that would be built similarly huge, they definitely wouldn't build such huge tables, chairs, and beds. Even Chu Fengmian saw that the cups placed on the table were 100 times bigger than ordinary cup. Chu Fengmian had never heard of such a place. Even in Sword Emperor Guan's memories, he had never heard of such a place. The laws here, Chu Fengmian woke up and could use his spiritual consciousness a little. After exploring for a while, Chu Fengmian discovered that the laws here were incomparably complex and the spatial laws were incomparably tough. Such laws definitely wouldn't exist in the extraterritorial starry sky. It seems that I've arrived at the 3 great sacred regions. I just don't know where this place is. Chu Fengmian muttered to himself. After exploring for a while, Chu Fengmian understood that he had arrived at the 3 great sacred regions. Although it was different from what Chu Fengmian had imagined, he still successfully arrived at the 3 great sacred regions in the midst of the chaos. However, the 3 saint domains were vast and boundless. How big were the 3 saint domains? Even an immortal emperor wouldn't be able to explore them all. There was once an immortal emperor who tried to travel to every place in the 3 sacred realms, but he failed in the end. However, the current maps of the 3 great sacred realms were all written by the former immortal emperor. There weren't many records of the 3 great sacred regions in the Sword Emperor Guan's memories. After all, the Upper Sword sect had always been in the 9 regions and the 9 regions of heaven. They didn't know much about the 3 great sacred regions. The Sword Emperor Crown's memories did not have any records of the remote places in the 3 sacred regions. The scene in front of him was clearly not in the region of the Sword Emperor Crown's memories. It looks like I was saved by someone? At this point, Chu Fengmian suddenly realized that his body was wrapped in strips of cloth. There was some medicinal liquid within the cloth. Someone had helped Chu Fengmian dress his wound. This strip of cloth was also incomparably large. It was only a single piece, but it completely covered Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian was completely wrapped up. These herbs are immortal blood herbs? Chu Fengmian sniffed the medicinal fragrance, and was a little surprised. Chu Fengmian had obtained the Upper Sword sect's inheritance, and also obtained many records of the Upper Sword sect's medicine hall. Chu Fengmian already knew many records of immortal herbs. The liquid that was applied to his body was none other than the immortal blood herb's juice. The immortal blood herb was an immortal herb. Although it was the most common immortal herb, it was still priceless. It was rumored that it had the effect of reviving the dead. Although its true effect wasn't as exaggerated as the rumors, it still had the effect of healing injuries and tempering the body. For example, the price of the immortal blood herb wasn't inferior to the price of an immortal weapon. In the 9 regions, there weren't many people who had heard of this immortal herb. Now, someone was using it to apply medicine on Chu Fengmian. This kind of action was extremely extravagant. Although this was the 3 great sacred regions and immortal herbs weren't as rare as the 9 regions. However, in the Sword Emperor Guan's memories, even in the 3 great sacred regions, the price of an immortal herb was equivalent to at least the price of an ancient sacred medicine in the 9 regions. It wasn't something that ordinary immortals could obtain. Ordinary immortal herbs had to be complemented by several immortal herbs and sacred medicines to be refined into elixirs in order to unleash its full medicinal effect. If it was applied directly to the body, the medicinal effect of the immortal blood herb wouldn't even be 10% or 20%. But now, Chu Fengmian was so severely injured that he couldn't be picky. Moreover, someone was using the immortal blood herb to heal Chu Fengmian's injuries. Obviously, it was to save Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian could only be grateful to this person. Although the effect of applying the immortal blood herb directly wasn't as good as refining it into elixirs, it was still an immortal herb after all. It could nourish the body and heal injuries. An endless stream of medicinal power flowed into Chu Fengmian's body. The immortal crystals in Chu Fengmian's body were slowly healing his injuries. A few hours passed. About a dozen immortal crystals had been completely healed. Chu Fengmian could finally use a little power. Although this little bit of power was extremely weak, it was enough for Chu Fengmian to use the sky-devouring secret technique once. The medicinal power of the immortal blood herb could only seep into Chu Fengmian's body slowly. It would take at least 7 to 8 days for the medicinal power to be completely absorbed. For Chu Fengmian, this was too slow. He needed to recover from his injuries as soon as possible. After all, although Chu Fengmian seemed to be safe, he still had to be careful in this unfamiliar place. Otherwise, he wouldn't have any strength to resist if there was any danger. Recovering from his injuries and strength was the most important thing. Chu Fengmian slowly activated the sky-devouring secret technique. With Chu Fengmian's strength, activating the sky-devouring secret technique should have been a piece of cake. However, Chu Fengmian's injuries were so severe that he didn't dare to use too much power. He could only accumulate power bit by bit to activate it. After a full 3 minutes, a small vortex condensed on Chu Fengmian's body. Chu Fengmian finally let out a sigh of relief. Chu Fengmian activated the sky-devouring secret technique and devoured the immortal blood herb on Chu Fengmian's body. In a few breaths' time, the immortal blood herb's juice was completely devoured by the sky-devouring secret technique. It turned into pure medicinal power and poured into Chu Fengmian's body. Chapter 2370. The elixir rushed into Chu Fengmian's body and was immediately devoured by the immortal crystal. After a few breaths of time, hundreds of immortal crystals were restored. This made Chu Fengmian feel a lot more relaxed, although only a small part of his injuries had been healed. However, there were no other immortal herbs to heal his injuries. Without immortal herbs, Chu Fengmian could only absorb the spiritual qi of heaven and earth bit by bit to heal his injuries. The spiritual qi of the 3 great sacred domains was much denser than that of the 9 domains. It was almost at the level of immortal qi. It was no wonder that the 9 domains had undergone drastic changes. The spiritual qi of heaven's 9 domains had become much denser just by opening a crack that was connected to it. It was said that the spiritual qi of heaven's 9 domains was denser than that of the 3 great sacred domains. With such dense spiritual qi, cultivating in heaven's 9 domains would be much faster. It was no wonder that the 3 great sacred domains had so many experts. Just the cultivation conditions alone were incomparable. Moreover, such pure spiritual qi could also grow many immortal herbs and sacred medicines. The growth conditions of immortal herbs and sacred medicines were extremely harsh. They could only grow in places with dense spiritual qi. However, in the 3 great sacred domains, almost everywhere was filled with dense spiritual qi. The disparity in resources in various aspects led to the disparity between the 9 domains and the 3 great sacred domains. However, it was unknown how long it would take for Chu Fengmian to heal his injuries with spiritual qi of heaven and earth. It might take decades or even centuries to fully heal his injuries. Chu Fengmian also decided that after he recovered some strength, he would take the initiative to look for immortal herbs to heal his injuries. Fortunately, I didn't lose anything. At this time, Chu Fengmian observed his body and found that his empty ring was still there. When he entered the Star Hole storm, Chu Fengmian threw his empty ring into an immortal crystal. Under the protection of the immortal crystal, the empty ring was still there. The empty ring was still there, along with the things that Chu Fengmian had taken from young Master Zero Sword. The monarch sword chi was still in Chu Fengmian's body. However, the supreme sword chi was now extremely weak. It hid in Chu Fengmian's body, and could not even activate a little bit of its power. In the Star Hole storm, Chu Fengmian had almost exhausted all his means to protect himself. The supreme sword chi's power was also exhausted in the Star Hole storm. Fortunately, the unparalleled sword chi was still present. As Chu Fengmian recovered his strength, the power of the unparalleled sword chi could also be recovered. The battle between Chu Fengmian and young Master Zero Sword had been extremely dangerous. He had almost died. Fortunately, he hadn't gained nothing. The King Sword Chi he had obtained from young Noble Zero Sword and the other supreme sword chis could be said to be Chu Fengmian's greatest harvest. Right now, Chu Fengmian had 2,990 strands of ultimate sword chi. He only needed the last 10 strands of ultimate sword chi to gather the 3,000 strands. Moreover, the King Sword Chi was also under Chu Fengmian's control. The 10 supreme sword chi in the hands of young Master Zero Jian were no longer a threat to Chu Fengmian. Without the King Sword Chi, young Master Zero Jian was no longer a threat to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian was a little disappointed. If he could obtain the last 10 strands of supreme sword chi in young Noble Zero's hands, he would be able to gather 3,000 strands of supreme sword chi. The power of the supreme sword chi would undergo a qualitative change. 3,000 supreme sword chis were unleashed at the same time, forming a sword formation. Just the power of the supreme sword chis alone was enough to fight against the celestial sage. Unfortunately, without the last 10 supreme sword chi, the power of the supreme sword chi would be greatly reduced. However, because of the immortal emperor, Chu Fengmian didn't have any chance to escape. After all, if he had hesitated, he would have died on the spot and wouldn't have been able to escape into the Star Cave storm. Chu Fengmian's escape was already a close shave. When I recover my strength, I'll find young Master Immortal Sword and get the last 10 supreme sword chi. Killing intent flashed in Chu Fengmian's eyes. He now had control of the 2,990 supreme sword chi. It wouldn't be difficult to find the last 10 supreme sword chi. Although the 3 saint domains were huge, young Master Immortal Sword wasn't a nobody. It shouldn't be difficult to find him. What Chu Fengmian was worried about was the immortal emperor behind him. However, it was impossible for an immortal emperor to protect young Master Immortal Sword all the time. After all, for an immortal emperor, giving him a protective jade talisman was already a great favor. Even their own children weren't qualified to be protected by an immortal emperor all the time. The most important thing now is to recover from my injuries. Chu Fengmian shook his head and quickly turned his thoughts back. His current strength was only at the level of an Emperor Realm Master. He hadn't even reached the Heaven Realm. In the 3 saint domains, where masters were as common as clouds, this strength was nothing. Chu Fengmian wouldn't have the strength to fight back. He had to recover his strength first before thinking about other things. Chu Fengmian opened young Master Immortal Sword's space ring. There were some immortal artifacts, materials, and so on. When he was in the Star Hole storm, Chu Fengmian took out all the healing pills in the space ring to resist the Star Hole storm. In the Star Hole storm, Chu Fengmian's strength was almost squeezed to the extreme, so he didn't dare to hold back. Most of the pills had been consumed in the Star Hole storm, but Chu Fengmian still found a few that had slipped through the net after searching young Master Immortal Sword's space ring. In the Star Hole storm, Chu Fengmian focused all his attention on how to resist the storm, so he didn't carefully search for some pills hidden in the corners. Chu Fengmian rummaged through Young Master Immortal Sword's space ring and found 2 immortal pills and 3 ancient saint pills. This result made Chu Fengmian feel helpless. With his injuries, even if he used immortal pills, he would need at least several hundred of them to fully recover. These pills were simply a drop in the bucket. But for the current Chu Fengmian, there was nothing he could be picky about. Now that he was in the 3 saint domains, in a completely unfamiliar place, Chu Fengmian would be safer if he could improve his strength even a little bit. Chu Fengmian took out the 5 pills and operated the heaven-devouring secret technique. Suddenly, the 5 pills were swallowed by the heaven-devouring secret technique and shattered, turning into extremely pure medicinal efficacies that poured into Chu Fengmian's body. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.